Old English Color Prints. By Malcolm C. Salaman. Old English Color Prints. Other pictures we look at, his prints we read, said Charles Lamb, speaking with affectionate reverence of Hogarth. Now, after reading those wonderful progresses of the rake and the harlot, which had for him all the effect of books, intellectually vivid with human interest, let us suppose our beloved essayist looking at those other pictures. Morland's Story of Letitia series, in John Raphael Smith's charming stipple plates, color-printed for choice, first issued while Lamb was hardly in his teens. Though they might not be, as in Hogarth's prints, intense thinking faces, expressive of permanent abiding ideas, in which he would read Letitia's world-old story, Lamb would doubtless look at these Morland prints with a difference. He would look at them with an interest awakened less by their not too poignant intention of dramatic pathos than by the charm of their simple pictorial appeal, heightened by the dainty persuasion of color. There is a fascination about 18th-century prints which tempts me in fancy to picture the gentle Elia stopping at every printseller's window that lay on his daily route to the East India House in Leadenhall Street. How many these were might admit a wide solution, since he arrived invariably late at the office, but Alderman Boydell's in Cheapside, where the engraving art could be seen in its dignified variety and beauty, and Mr. Carrington Bowles's in St. Paul's Churchyard, with the humorous mezzotints, plain and colored, must have stayed him long. Then, surely among the old color prints which charm us today there were some that would make their contemporary appeal to Elia's fancy, as he would linger among the curious crowd outside the windows of Mr. J.R. Smith in King Street, Covent Garden, or Mr. Macklin's Poets' Gallery in Fleet Street, Mr. Tompkins in Bond Street, or Mr. Colnaghi, Bartolozzi's much-beloved Senior Colnaghi, in Pall Mall. Not Arcadian scenes, perhaps, with flocks of silly sheep, nor boys as infant Bacchuses or Jupiters, nor even the beautiful ladies of rank and fashion. But the cries of London at Colnaghi's must have arid so true a Londoner, and may we not imagine the relish with which Lamb would stop to look at the prints of the players? The Downman Misses. Siddons, say, or the Miss Farron, or that most joyous of Romney prints, Mrs. Jordan as the Romp, which would seem to give pictorial justification for Lamb's own vivid reminiscence of the actress, as his words lend almost the breath of life to the picture. Yet these had not then come to the dignity of bold prints, with a mellow lure of antique tone. Their beautiful soft paper, handmade as a matter of course, since there was no other, which we handle and hold up to the light with such sensitive reverence, was not yet grown venerable from the touch of long-vanished hands. They were as fresh as a busy industry of engravers, printers, and paper-makers could turn them out, and of a contemporary popularity that died early of a plethora. What, then, is their peculiar charm for us today? Those color prints of stipple or mezzotint engravings which pervaded the later years of the 18th century, and the earliest of the 19th. No serious student, perhaps, would accord them a very high or important place in the history of art. Yet a pleasant little corner of their own they certainly merit, representing, as they do, a characteristic contemporary phase of popular taste and of artistic activity, essentially English. Whatever may be thought of their intrinsic value as works of art, there is no denying their special appeal of pictorial prettiness and sentiment and of dainty decorative charm. Nor, to judge from the recent records of the sale rooms, would this appeal seem to be of any uncertain kind. It has lately been eloquent enough to compete with the claims of artistic works of indisputable worth. And those collectors who have heard it for the first time only during the last 10 years or so have had to pay highly for their belated responsiveness. Those, on the other hand, who listened long ago to the gentle appeal of the old English color prints, who listened before the market had heard it, and, loving them for their own pretty sakes, or their old-time illustrative interest, or their decorative accompaniment to Sheraton and Chippendale, would pick them up in the printsellers' shops for equitable sums that would now be regarded as mere songs. Can today look round their walls at the rare and brilliant impressions of prints which first charmed them 20 or 30 years ago, and smile contentedly at the inflated prices clamorous from Christie's. For nowadays the decorative legacy of the 18th century, a legacy of dignity, elegance, beauty, charm, seems to involve ever-increasing legacy duties, which must be paid ungrudgingly. A collector, whose house is permeated with the charm and beauty of 18th-century arts and crafts, asked recently my advice as to what he should next begin to collect. I suggested the original pictures of the more accomplished and promising of our younger living painters, a comparatively inexpensive luxury. He shook his head, and, before the evening, a choice William Ward, exceptional in color, had proved irresistible. Yes, it is a curious and noteworthy fact that the collector of Old English color prints has rarely, if ever, any sympathy with modern art, however fine, however beautiful. He will frankly admit this, and, while he tells you that he loves color, you discover that it is only color which has acquired the mellowing charm of time and old associations. So your color print collector will gladly buy a dainty drawing by Downman, delicately tinted on the back, or a pastel by J.R. Smith, somewhat purple, maybe, in the flesh tints, while the sumptuous coloring of a Brangwyn will rouse in him no desire for possession, a Lavery's harmonies will stir him not at all. And the mystic beauty of tones in any late moonrise that a Clausen may paint will say to him little or nothing. But then, one may ask, why is he content with the simple color schemes of these dainty and engaging prints, when the old Japanese, and still older Chinese color prints offer wonderful and beautiful harmonies that no English color printer ever dreamt of? And why, if we chance to meet this lover of color at the National Gallery, do we find him, not reveling joyously in the marvelously rich, luminous tones of a Filipino Lippi, for example, or the glorious hues of a Titian, but quietly happy in front of, say, Moreland's inside of a stable, or Reynolds's snake in the grass? Well, we have only to pass a little while in his rooms, looking at his prints in their appropriate environment of beautiful old furniture, giving ourselves up to the pervading old-time atmosphere, and we shall begin to understand him and sympathize with his consistency. And, as the spell works, we shall find ourselves growing convinced that even a Venice set of Whistler etchings would seem decoratively incongruous amid those particular surroundings. For it is the spell, not of intrinsic artistic beauty, but of the 18th century that is upon us. It is the spell of a graceful period, compact of charm, elegance and sensibility, that these pretty old color prints, so typically English in subject and design, cast over us as we look at them. Thus they present themselves to us, not as so many mere engravings printed in varied hues, but rather as so many pictorial messages, whispered smilingly, some of them, from those years of ever-fascinating memory, when the newly born Royal Academy was focusing the artistic taste and accomplishment of the English people, and Reynolds, Gainsborough, Romney, were translating the typical transient beauty in terms of enduring art. While the great engravers were extending the painter's fame, and the furniture makers and all the craftsmen were supporting them with a new and a classic grace. When Johnson was talking stately, inspiring common sense, Goldsmith was writing like an angel, and Sheridan was catching the manners living as they rose, when Fanny Burney was keeping her vivid diaries, and Walpole and Mrs. Delaney were, we thank Providence, writing letters. When the doings of the players at Drury Lane and Covent Garden, or the fashionable revellers at Ranelagh, Vauxhall, and the Pantheon, were as momentous to the town as the debates at Westminster. And the lovely Duchess could immortalize a parliamentary election with a democratic kiss. These prints, hinting of Fielding and Richardson, Goldsmith and Sterne, tell us that sentiment, romantic, rustic and domestic, had become as fashionable as wit and elegance, and far more popular. While a spreading feeling for nature, awakened by the poetry of Thomson, Gray and Collins, and nurtured later by Cooper, Crabbe and Burns, was forming a popular taste quite out of sympathy with the cold academic formalism and trammelled feeling of the age of Pope. These literary influences are important to consider for any true appreciation of these old color prints, which, being a reflex in every respect of the popular spirit and character of the period in which they were produced, no other period could have bequeathed to us exactly as they are. And it is especially interesting to remember this, for, from the widespread popularity of these very prints, we may trace, in the pictures their great vogue called for, the origin of that abiding despot of popular English art which Whistler has, in his whimsical way, defined as the British subject. That the evolution of the color print, from its beginnings in chiaroscuro, can boast a long and fascinating history has been proved to admiration in the romantic and informing pages of Mrs. Franca's 18th-century color prints, a pioneer volume, but my present purpose is to tell the story only in so far as it concerns English art and taste. Now, although during the 17th century we had in England a number of admirable and industrious engravers, we hear of no attempts among them to print engravings in anything but monochrome. So that, if they heard of the color experiments of Hercules Segers, the Dutch etcher, whom Rembrandt admired, as doubtless they did hear. Considering how constant and friendly was their intercourse with the Dutch and Flemish painters and engravers, none apparently thought it worth while to pursue the idea. But, after all, Segers merely printed his etchings in one color on a tinted paper, which can hardly be described as real color printing. And, if there had been any artistic value in the notion, would not the enterprising Haller have attempted some use of it? Nor were our English line engravers moved by any rumors they may have heard, or specimens they may have seen, of the experiments in color printing, made somewhere about 1680, by Johannes Taylor, of Nijmegen in Holland, a painter, engraver, mathematical professor and military engineer. His were unquestionably the first true color prints, being impressions taken from one plate, the engraved lines of which were carefully painted with inks of different hues. And these prints may be seen in the British Museum, collected in all their numerous variety in the interesting and absolutely unique volume which Taylor evidently, to judge from the ornately engraved title page, designed to publish as Opus Typochromaticum. The experiment was of considerable interest, but one has only to look at these color-printed line engravings, with their crude juxtaposition of tints, to feel thankful that our English line engravers were not lured from their allegiance to the black and white proper to their art. Doubtless they recognized that color was opposed to the very spirit of the line engraver's art, just as, 100 years later, the stipple engravers realized that it could often enhance the charm of their own. In the black and white of a fine engraving there is a quality in the balancing of relative tones which in itself answers to the need of color, which, in fact, suggests color to the imagination. So the beauty and dignity of the graven line in a master's hands must repel any adventitious chromatic aid. A Faithorn print, for instance, with its lines and cross-hatchings in colors is inconceivable. Although one might complacently imagine Francis Place and Gaywood having, not inappropriately, experimented with Barlow's birds and beasts after the manner of those in Taylor's book. If, however, there were any English engravings of that period on which Taylor's method of color printing might have been tried with any possibility of, at least, a popular success, they were surely Pierce Tempest's curious cries of the City of London, after old Larune's designs, which antedated by just over 100 years the charming Wheatley cries, so familiar, so desirable, in colored stipple. But this was not to be, and not until the new and facile mezzotint method had gradually overshadowed in popularity the older and more laborious line engraving was the first essay in color printing made in England. In the year 1719 came Jacob Christopher Leblond with his new invention, which he called printing paintings. This invention was in effect a process of taking separate impressions, one over the other, from 3 plates of a desired picture, engraved in mezzotint, strengthened with line and etching, and severally inked each with the proportion of red, yellow, or blue, which, theorizing according to Newton, Leblond considered would go to make, when blended, the true color tones of any picture required. In fact, Leblond practically anticipated the 3-color process of the present day, but in 1719 all the circumstances were against his success, bravely and indefatigably as he fought for it, influentially as he was supported. Jacob Christopher Leblond was a remarkable man, whose ingenious mind and restless, enthusiastic temperament led him through an artistic career of much adventure and many vicissitudes. Born in Frankfurt in 1667, when Chinese artists were producing those marvels of color printing lately discovered by Mr. Lawrence Binyon in the British Museum, he studied painting and engraving for a while with Conrad Meyer, of Zurich, and subsequently in the studio of the famous Carlo Maratti at Rome, whither he had gone in 1696, in the suite of Count Martinet's, the French ambassador. His studies seem to have been as desultory as his way of living. His friend Overbeck, however, recognizing that Leblanc had talents which might develop with concentrated purpose, induced him in 1702 to settle down in Amsterdam and commence miniature painter. The pictures in little which he did for snuff-boxes, bracelets, and rings, won him reputation and profit, but the minute work affected his eyesight, and instead he turned to portrait painting in oils. Then the idea came to him of imitating oil paintings by the color printing process, based on Newton's theory of the three-color composition of light, as I have described. Experimenting with promising results on paintings of his own, he next attempted to reproduce the pictures of the Italian masters, from which, under Marotti's influence, he had learnt the secrets of color. Without revealing his process, he showed his first, printed paintings, to several puzzled admirers, among them Prince Eugene of Savoy and, it is said, the famous Earl of Halifax, Newton's friend, who invented the national debt and the Bank of England. But, sanguine as Leblanc was that there was a fortune in his invention, he could obtain for it neither a patent nor financial support, though he tried for these at Amsterdam, The Hague, and Paris. His opportunity came, however, when he met with Colonel Sir John Guise. An enthusiastic connoisseur of art, a collector of pictures, he left his collection to Christchurch College, Oxford, an heroic soldier, with a turn for fantastic exaggeration and romancing, which moved even Horace Walpole to protest. And called him madder than ever. Guise was just the man to be interested in the personality and the inventive schemes of Leblanc. Easily he persuaded the artist to come to London, and, through his introduction to many influential persons, he enlisted for Leblanc the personal interest of the king, who granted a royal patent, and permitted his own portrait to be done by the new process, of which this presentment of George I is certainly one of the most successful examples, happiest in tone harmony. Then, in 1721, a company was formed to work under the patent, with an establishment known as the Picture Office, and Leblanc himself to direct operations. Everything promised well, the public credit had just been restored after the South Sea bubble, the shares were taken up to a substantial extent, and for a time all went well. An interesting prospectus was issued, with a list of color prints after pictures, chiefly sacred and mythological, by Marotti, Annibale Carracci, Titian, Correggio, Van Dyck, some of them being identical in size with the original paintings, at such moderate prices as 10, 12, and 15 shillings. Lord Percival, Pope's friend, who, like Colonel Guise, had entered practically into the scheme, was enthusiastic about the results. Sending some of the prints, with the bill for them, to his brother, he wrote, "Our modern painters can't come near it with their colors, and if they attempt to copy make us pay as many guineas as now we pay shillings." Certainly, if we compare Leblanc's Madonna after Baroccio, priced 15 shillings in the prospectus, for instance, with such an example of contemporary painting as that by Sir James Thornhill and his assistants, taken from a house in Leadenhall Street, and now at South Kensington, we may find some justification for Lord Percival's enthusiasm. For color quality there is, perhaps, little to choose between them, but as a specimen of true color printing, and the first of its kind, that Madonna is wonderful, and I question whether, in the later years, there was any color printing of mezzotint to approach it in brilliance of tone. Then, however, accuracy of harmonies was assured by adopting Robert Lorry's method, approved in 1776, of printing from a single plate, warmed and lightly wiped after application of the colored inks. Discouragement soon fell upon the Picture Office. In March 1722 Lord Percival wrote, "The picture project has suffered under a great deal of mismanagement, but yet improves much." In spite of that improvement, however, a meeting of shareholders was held under the chairmanship of Colonel Guise, and Leblanc's management was severely questioned. The shareholders appear to have heckled him quite in the modern manner, and he replied excitedly to every hostile statement that it was false. But there was no getting away from figures. At a cost of £5,000 Leblanc had produced 4,000 copies of his prints. These were from 25 plates, which, if all had been sold at the prices fixed, would have produced a net loss of £2,000. Even Colonel Guise could hardly consider these as satisfactory business methods, and the company had already been reorganized, with a new manager named Gine, who had introduced a cheaper and more profitable way of producing the prints. It was all to no purpose. Prints to the value of only £600 were sold at an expenditure of £9,000, while the tapestry weaving branch of the business, also Leblanc's scheme, showed an even more disproportionate result. Bankruptcy followed as a matter of course, and Leblanc narrowly escaped imprisonment. The color printing of engravings, though artistically promising, while still experimental, had certainly proved a financial failure, but Leblanc, nothing daunted, sought to explain and justify his principles and his practice in a little book called Colorito, or the Harmony of Coloring in Painting, reduced to mechanical practice, under easy precepts and infallible rules. This he dedicated to Sir Robert Walpole, hoping, perhaps, that the First Lord of the Treasury, who had just restored the nation's credit, might do something for an inventive artist. Next he was privileged to submit his inventions to the august notice of the Royal Society. Leblanc had always his opportunities, and well his rebuff from fortune, but his faith in himself and his ideas was unswerving. Moreover, he had the gift of transmitting this faith to others. At last a scheme for imitating Raphael's cartoons in tapestry, carried on at works in Chelsea, led to further financial disaster and discredit, and Leblanc was obliged to fly from England. In Paris he resumed his color printing, inspiring and influencing many disciples and imitators, among them Jacques-Fabien Gautier d'Agady, who afterwards claimed to have invented Leblanc's process, and transmitted it to his sons. In Paris, in 1741, Leblanc died, very, very poor, but still working upon his copper plates. It was doubtless during Leblanc's last years in Paris that Horace Walpole met him. He was a Fleming, sick, and very far from young when I knew him, but of surprising vivacity and volubility, and with a head admirably mechanic. But an universal projector, and with, at least, one of the qualities that attend that vocation, either a dupe or a cheat, I think the former, though, as most of his projects ended in the air, the sufferers believed the latter. As he was much an enthusiast, perhaps like most enthusiasts he was both one and t'other. As a matter of fact, Leblanc was neither a dupe nor a cheat, he was simply a pioneer with all the courage of his imagination and invention. And no less an authority than Herr Hans W. Singer, of Vienna, has considered him, with all his failures and shortcomings, of sufficient artistic importance to be worthy of a monograph. If, by a more judicious selection of pictures for copying, Leblanc had been able to create a popular demand, and to ensure general encouragement for his venture, how different might have been the story of color printing. How much fuller its annals. For Leblanc's ultimate failure was not owing to the comparative impossibility or getting infallibly the required harmonics of his tones with only the three cardinal colors, and the necessity to add a fourth plate with a qualifying black. Or to the difficulty in achieving the exactness of register essential to the perfect fusing of the tones of several plates. Those were serious obstacles, certainly, hindering complete artistic success, but, judging from the surprising excellence of the best of Leblanc's actual achievements, they would doubtless have been surmounted for all practical purposes. The real cause of the failure was, I suggest, that the pictures actually reproduced made no appeal to the people of England, consequently there was no public demand for the prints. It was a close time for the fine arts in this country. The day of the public picture exhibition was nearing, but it had not yet arrived. The aristocratic collector and the fashionable connoisseur represented the taste of the country, for popular taste there was none. Romance and sentiment were quite out of fashion, and the literature of the day was entirely opposed to them. Nor were there any living painters with even one touch of nature. The reign of George I was indeed a depressing time for the graphic arts. Society, heavily bewigged and monstrously behooked, was too much concerned with its pastimes and intrigues, its affectations, caprices and extravagances, to cultivate any taste or care for beauty. Kent, the absurdly fashionable architect, was ruling in place of the immortal Wren, and Kneller was so long and so assuredly the pictorial idol of the country that Pope, its poet-in-chief, could actually write of him that great nature feared he might outvie her works. Then, all else of pictorial art meant either Thornhill's wearisome ceilings and staircases, or the stiff and tasteless portraiture, with stereotyped posture, of the lesser Knellers, such as Jonathan Richardson, Highmore, and Jervas. whom Pope made even more ridiculous by his praises. With only such painters as these to interpret, what chance had even such admirable engravers as John Smith, George White, John Simon, Faber, Peter Pelham, whose mezzotints even were beginning to wane in favor for lack of pictorial interest. It is no great wonder then that, seeing Leblanc's failure, in spite of all his influence and achievement, the engravers in mezzotint were not eager to try the principles of his colorido in their own practice. And so color printing suffered a setback in this country. But Leblanc's prints are of great value today. What, then, has become of those 9,000 copies printed by the picture office? The £600 worth sold before the bankruptcy must have represented about 1,000, yet these impressions from Leblanc's 50 plates are of extreme rarity even in the museums of the world, and it has been suggested by Hersinger, and also by Mr. A. M. Hind, in his valuable History of Engraving and Etching, that many copies of the large prints, varnished over, may be hanging in old houses under the guise of oil paintings, thus fulfilling their original purpose. It is an interesting conjecture, and how plausible one may judge from the varnished copies in the British Museum. Leblanc's really important venture inspired no imitators in England, but it was followed by a few experimental attempts to embellish engravings with color. These were chiefly adaptations of the old chiaroscuro method, surface color being obtained by using several woodblocks in combination with engraved copperplates. Arthur Pond and Charles Knapton, painters both, imitated a number of drawings in this manner, the designs being etched. While, some years earlier, Elisha Kirkall, Bounteous Kirkall, of the Dunciad, had successfully used the colored woodblocks with mezzotint plates, strengthened with etched and graven lines. His pupil, J. B. Jackson, however, engraved only wood for his remarkable prints. But these experiments were merely sporadic, they led to nothing important and continuous in the way of color printing. Meanwhile, the prints of Hogarth, with their marvelous pictorial invention, mordant satire, and moral illumination, took the fancy of the town without the lure of color, and cultivated in the popular mind a new sense of picture, concerned with the live human interest of the passing hour. Other line engravers, too, Vivars, Woollet, Ravenet, Major, Strange, with more masterly handling of the graver, were, through the new appeal of landscape, or the beauties of Rembrandt and the Italian masters, or the homely humors of Dutch genre, winning back the popular favor for their art. Though the call for the color print had not yet arrived, the way was preparing for it. With this widening public interest in pictorial art, a dainty sense of tone was awakened by the porcelain now efflorescing all over the country. Then, when Reynolds was bringing all the graces to his easel, the urbane influence for beauty spread from the master's painting room at 47, Leicester Fields, as the square was then called, to all the print shops in town. And the year, 1764, that saw the death of Hogarth was the year in which Francesco Bartolozzi came to England, bringing with him into the engraving world fresh influences of grace and delicacy which gradually ripened for color. 2. The sentimental mood for the storied picture was now being fostered by the universal reading of the novel, which in its mid-18th century form gave its readers new experiences in the presentation of actual contemporary life, with analysis of their feelings and cultivation of their sensibilities. Pamela and Clarissa Harlowe, Sophia Western and Amelia, Olivia, Maria, were as living in interest as any of the beautiful high-born ladies whose portraits in mezzotint, translated from the canvases of the great painters, appealed from the printsellers' windows in all the monochrome beauty of their medium. The public, steeped now in sentiment, wanted to see their imaginary heroines in picture, nor had they long to wait. The Royal Academy had become a vital factor in forming public taste, and the printsellers' shops were its mirrors. But not all its members and exhibitors were Gainsboroughs and Reynoldses. There were, for instance, Angelica Kauffman and Cipriani, with their seductive Italian graces of design. There was Bartolozzi, with his beautiful draftsmanship, and his brilliant facile craft on the copperplate, but the medium that should bring these into familiar touch with popular taste was still to seek. However, it was at hand, and the man who found this medium, and brought it to the service of popular art, was William Wynne Ryland, engraver to the King. Whether the so-called crayon method of engraving, in imitation of soft chalk drawings, was invented by Jean-Charles François, or Gilles de Marteau, or Louis Bonnet, all three claimed the credit of it. It was, at all events, from François, whose claim had obtained official recognition, that Ryland, the pupil of Ravenet and L'Obéas, and, in a measure, of Boucher, learned the method while he was still a student in Paris. Only later in his career, however, long after he had left behind him his student days in Paris and Rome, and achieved prosperity in London as a line engraver and printseller, with royal patronage, and with social success as a man of fashion and pleasure, did he remember the process that François had imparted to him. Then, in his necessity, when his extravagances had brought him to bankruptcy, he called the dotted crayon manner to memory, and saw in stipple engraving, if suitably employed, a possible asset of importance. Compared with line and even with mezzotint, it was a very easy and rapid way of engraving, and though, of course, it could not compare with either in nobility, richness and brilliance of effect, Ryland realized that its soft rendering of tones by artistically balanced masses of dots might be adapted to dainty and delicate drawings. The most fortunate opportunity for proving this was at hand. He had some personal acquaintance with Angelica Kauffmann, whom Lady Wentworth had brought to London some 10 years before, and whose beauty, talents, and personal charm had meanwhile made her a fashionable artistic idol. With society and its beauties flocking to her studio to be painted or to buy her pictures. Having first tested his stippling with his own designs, gracefully French in manner, which he published soon afterwards as Domestic Employments, Ryland suggested the idea of stipple engraving to the sympathetic young painter. When he had experimented with one or two of her drawings, she gladly recognized that stipple was the very medium for the interpretation of her work to the public. The first prints sold like wildfire, and so satisfied was Ryland of the profitable prospect, that, on the strength of it, he promptly re-established himself in a print-selling business at 159, Strand. His confidence was amply justified, the public being quick to show their appreciation of the new method, introduced as it was with all the persuasion of the fair Angelica's graceful, fanciful designs of classic story in allegory. This was in 1775, and within a very short time Ryland found that, rapidly as she designed and he engraved, he could scarcely keep pace with the demand for these prints, which, the more readily to crave the popular fancy, he printed in red ink. To imitate red chalk, later to be known as the Bartolozzi red. Ryland had called Bartolozzi into consultation, and the gifted Italian engraver, with his greater mastery of technique, his delicate sense of beauty, and his finer artistic perceptions, had seen all that might be done with the new way of stipple. He saw also its limitations. With enthusiasm Bartolozzi and Ryland had worked together till they had evolved from the crayon manner of François a process of engraving which proved so happily suited to the classes of fanciful and sentimental prints now fast becoming the vogue, that it simply jumped into a popularity which no other medium of the engraver's art had ever attained. The stipple method may be thus described. The copper plate was covered with an etching ground, onto which the outlined picture was transferred from paper. Then the contours of the design were lightly etched in a series of dots, all the dark and middle shadows being rendered by larger or more closely etched dots, the later engravers using even minute groups of dots. This accomplished, the acid was next applied with very great care, and all the etched dots bitten in. The waxen ground was then removed from the plate, and the work with the dry point and the curved stipple graver was commenced. With these tools the lighter shadows were accomplished, and the bitten portions of the picture were deepened and strengthened wherever required, to attain greater fullness or brilliance of effect. Engraving in dots was, of course, no new thing. As an accessory to line engraving it had often been called into service by the earlier artists. Giulio Campagnola, Albert Dürer, Agostino Veneziano, Ottavio Leoni, for example, had used it. We frequently find it employed by our own 17th-century linemen the better to suggest flesh tones, and Ludwig von Ziegen, in describing his invention of mezzotint in 1642, includes the dotted manner among the known forms of engraving. Then there was the opus mallet, or method of punching dots in the plate with a mallet and awl, which was successfully practiced by Jan Lutma, of Amsterdam, late in the 17th century. This may be considered the true precursor of stipple, just as the harpsichord, with the same keyboard, but a different manner of producing the notes, was the precursor of the pianoforte. But it must have been a very laborious process, and Lutma found few imitators. Under the aegis of Ryland and Bartolozzi, however, and with the inspiration of Angelica Kauffmann's harmonious but shackled fancy, as a contemporary critic put it, for its initial impetus, stipple was developed as a separate and distinctive branch of the engraver's art. Its popularity was now to be further enhanced by the gentle and persuasive aid of color. Ryland had seen many specimens of color printing in Paris, when he was with François and with Boucher. He now bethought him that, just as the public fancy had been captured by red chalk imitations, so might it be enchanted by engraved representations of watercolor drawings actually printed in colors. Angelica Kauffmann and Bartolozzi eagerly encouraged the idea, and the two engravers, after many experiments, determined the best process of coloring and printing from the plates. Apparently they rejected the multiplate method tried 6 years previously by that interesting artist Captain William Bailey, and Ryland's earliest color prints were partially tinted only with red and blue. Mrs. Francois tells us, on the authority of a tradition handed down in his old age from James Menassi, one of Bartolozzi's most trusted pupils, that an Alsatian named Seigneur was responsible for all the earlier color-printed impressions of Ryland's and Bartolozzi's stipples after Angelica Kauffmann and Cipriani, that then he set up on his own account as a color printer. Much recommended by Bartolozzi, and largely employed by the publishers, and that his printing may be traced, though unsigned, by a transparency of tone due to the use of a certain vitreous white which he imported in a dry state from Paris. Menassi must, of course, have been a perfect mine of Bartolozzi traditions, but when my father in his boyhood knew him and his musical son, the distinguished engraver would talk of nothing but music, for in 1829, with steel plates superseding the copper, and lithography triumphant, there seemed no prospect that the colored stipples, already some time out of fashion, would 80 years later be inspiring curiosity as to how they were done. One sees, of course, many feeble color prints of the period, which of old the undiscriminating public accepted as readily as today they buy, for old prints, modern cheap foreign reproductions which would disgrace a sixpenny summer number. On the other hand, the really fine examples of the old-time color printing, combined with brilliant engraving, and, of course, only fine things are the true collector's desiderata, irrespective of margins and state letterings. And other foolish fads, are certainly works of art, though a very delicate art of limited compass. These color prints were done with a single printing, and the plate had to be freshly inked for each impression. The printer would have a watercolor drawing to work from, and having decided upon the dominant tint, with this he would ink over the whole engraved surface of the plate. Then he would wipe it almost entirely out of the incisions and punctures on the copper which had retained it, leaving just a sufficient harmonizing ground tint for the various colored inks, carefully selected as to tints, which were next applied in the exact order and degree to ensure the right harmonies. All this required the nicest care directed by a very subtle sense of color. Most difficult of all, and reserved for the last stage of the inking, was adding the flesh tints, an operation of extreme delicacy. Then, before putting the plate in the printing press, it had to be warmed to the exact degree of sensitiveness which should help the colors to fuse with tenderness and softness, without losing any brilliant quality of tone. This was not the least anxious part of the work, needing highly trained artistic sensibility on the part of the printer. How artistically important this matter of warming the plates must have been in printing a combination of colored inks may be judged when I say that I have been privileged to watch Whistler warming his etched plates ready for the printing press, and seen him actually quivering with excited sensibility as the plate seemed to respond sensitively to the exigence of his own exquisite sense of tone. But, of course, no 18th-century color prints, however charming in tone, suggest that there were any Whistlers engaged in the printing of them. Perhaps that is why our modern master of the copperplate never cared for these dainty things, as he did greatly care for Japanese color prints. The old printers, however, had their own definite manner of work, and their own tricks of experience for producing pleasing and brilliant effects. By the dusting of a little dry color onto the moist, here and there, during the printing process, they could heighten tones, or by very lightly dragging a piece of muslin over the surface of the plate they could persuade the tints to a more tender and harmonious intimacy. Of course, when the plate was printed, the color was taken only by the dots and lines of the engraving, the white paper peeping between. If would-be buyers of color prints would only remember this simple fact, and examine the stippling closely to see whether it really shows the color, they would not so constantly be deceived into buying entirely hand-colored prints. Whether the old printers and engravers authorized and sponsored the touching up of the prints with watercolor, which one almost invariably finds, at least to some slight extent, even in the best examples, with rare exceptions, it is impossible to determine. At all events, it is presumable that the eyes and lips were touched up before the prints left the publishers' shops. It must not be supposed, however, that color had ousted from public favor the print in monochrome. As a matter of fact, it was usually only after the proofs and earlier brilliant impressions in monochrome had been worked off, and the plate was beginning to look a little worn, that the aid of color was called in to give the print a fresh lease of popularity. Indeed, with mezzotint a slightly worn plate generally took the colors most effectively. This is why one sees so very seldom an engraver's proof in colors, the extreme rarity of its appearance making always a red-letter moment at Christie's. Therefore, in spite of the ever-widening vogue of the color print, it was always the artist and engraver that counted, while the printer in colors was scarcely ever named. And the new industry of stipple engraving may be said to have been, in its first days of popularity, monopolized almost by Ryland and Bartolozzi, in association with Angelica Kauffman and John Baptist Cipriani. Cipriani had, by his elegant and tasteful designs, won immediate favor on his arrival in England, and even the Lord Mayor's coach was decorated with panels of his painting. His style prepared the way for Angelica Kauffman, and together they soon brought a new pictorial element to the service of home decoration. Their graceful rhythmic treatment of classic fables was just what the brothers Adam wanted for their decorative schemes, and the two Italian artists were extensively employed to paint panels for walls and ceilings. In time the fair Angelica outdistanced Cipriani in popularity, and, painting panels for cabinets, commodes, pier table tops, and other pieces of decorative furniture, her taste was soon dominating that of the fashionable world. No wonder then that, when Ryland and Bartolozzi, through the medium of their facile and adaptable engravings, made her charming, if not flawlessly drawn, compositions readily accessible, the public eagerly bought them, and, framing them, generally without any margin, according to their own oval and circular forms, found them the very mural adornments that the prevailing Adam taste seemed to suggest. In monochrome or in colors, the prints, with their refined and fluent fancies, pictured from Horace, Ovid, Virgil, Homer, and Angelica's beautiful face and figure vivid in several, had an extraordinarily wide appeal. They flattered the fashionable culture of the day, when to quote Horace familiarly in ordinary conversation was almost a patent of gentility. On the continent they were even copied for the decoration of porcelain. For Ryland this meant another spell of prosperity, it also meant disaster. His constant thirst for pleasure, and his ambition to shine as a fine gentleman, stimulated by such easy and seemingly inexhaustible means of money-making, led him into fatal extravagances. Accused of forging a bill, instead of facing the charge, of which he protested his innocence, he stupidly hid himself and tried ineffectually to cut his own throat. After that, some flimsy evidence procured his condemnation, and, as William Blake, looking in Ryland's face, had predicted years before, he was hanged at Tyburn in 1783. They could have done no worse to a highwayman. And, after all, by the introduction of stipple engraving Ryland had certainly increased the people's stock of harmless pleasure. In his own stippling there was a delicacy of touch, a smoothness of effect, equal to Bartolozzi's, but with less tenderness and suppleness of tone. Evidently he formed his style to suit the designs of Angelica Kauffman, which it rendered with appreciation of their refinement. This will be seen in the charming Cupid bound to a tree by nymphs, among our illustrations, and many other pleasing plates, such as Venus presenting Helen to Paris, Beauty crowned by Love, The Judgment of Paris, Ludit Amabiliter, O Venus Regina. Olim truncus, dormio innocuous, Juno sestum, Maria, from Sterne's Sentimental Journey, for which Miss Benwell, the painter, is said to have sat. Patience and Perseverance. Morning Amusement, a fanciful portrait of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, embroidering at a tambour frame, and wearing the Turkish costume which she so graphically describes in one of her letters, and in which Kneller had painted her at the instigation of Pope. Fancy portraits, too, of the adventurous Lady Hester Stanhope, and Mary, Duchess of Richmond. Although Angelica Kauffmann had Bartolozzi in his numerous disciple, which meant, of course, most of the best stipple engravers of the day, at the service of her prolific pencil, her favorite of all was Thomas Burke. In this she proved her sound judgment, for certainly no other stipple engraver, not Bartolozzi himself, could equal Burke's poetic feeling upon the copper, or surpass him in his artistic mastery of the medium. After studying, it is believed, at the art school of the Royal Dublin Society, he came to London to learn mezzotin engraving under his talented countryman, John Dickson, who was winning reputation as one of Reynolds's ablest immortalizers. To borrow the master's own word, Burke soon showed that he could scrape a mezzotint with the best of them, but the pupil's manner developed on his own lines, differing from the master's in a more tender and luminous touch, a greater suavity of tone. These qualities are patent in his beautiful rendering of Angelica Kauffmann's Telemachus at the court of Sparta, and it was only natural that they should suggest his adopting the stipple method. The technique he learnt from Ryland, and unquestionably he bettered the instruction. The painter's sense of effect, which Dickson had taught him to translate into mezzotint, was of incalculable value to him in his use of the new medium, for by an individual manner of infinitely close stippling suggestive of the rich broad tone surfaces of mezzotint, he achieved, perhaps, the most brilliant and beautiful effects that stipple engraving has ever produced. Burke, in fact, was an artist, who, seeing a picture, realized how to interpret it on the copperplate with the just expression of all its tone beauties. There is a glow about his engraving which shows the art of stipple at the very summit of its possibilities, and, happily, brilliant impressions of several of his plates were printed in colors. Thus, in such beautiful prints as Lady Rushout and Daughter, Rinaldo and Armida, a flower painted by Verhulst, Angelica Kauffmann as designed listening to the inspiration of poetry, Cupid and Ganymede, Jupiter and Callisto, Cupid binding Aglaia, Una and Abra, to name, perhaps, the gems among Burke's Kauffmann prints, is shown what artistic results could be compassed when stipple engraving and color printing met at their best. If, however, Angelica's engaging fantasies inspired Burke to his masterpieces, not less exquisite was his rendering of Plimer's miniatures of the Rushout daughters, while his art could interpret with equal charm the homely idyllic picture. As may be seen in the pretty favorite chickens, Saturday morning, going to market, after the popular W. Arth Big, and the vicar of the parish receiving his tithes, after Singleton. But there are pictures by the masters one would like Burke to have engraved. The strange thing is that he did not do them. Most of the engravers were now wooing the facile and profitable popularity of the stipple method and the color print, and all the favorite painters of the day, from the president of the Royal Academy to the lady amateur, were taking advantage of the fashion. The constancy and infinitude of the demand were so alluring, and the popular taste, never artistically very exacting, had been flattered and coaxed into a mood which seemed very easy to please. It asked only for the pretty thing. Sir Joshua Reynolds, seeing, doubtless, what delicious and popular things Bartolozzi had made of Cipriani's Cupids and Graces, was readily induced to lend himself, in the lighter phases of his art, to the copperplates of the stipple engravers, pleasantly assisted by the color printer. Still leaving the more dignified and pictorially elaborate examples of his brush, the beautiful, elegant, full-length portraits of lovely and distinguished women and notable men, to the gracious interpretation of mezzotint, which had served him so nobly and faithfully, he found that, in the hands of such artists on copper as Bartolozzi, John Jones, Caroline Watson, Wilkin, Cheeseman, Dickinson, Nutter, Schiavonetti, Marquard, Thomas Watson, John Peter Simon, Grosser, Collier, J. R. Smith, the delicate art of stipple could express all the sweetness, tenderness, and grace he intended in the pictures he enjoyed to paint of children and of girlish beauty. So we have such delightful prints, both in monochrome and in color, as the Honourable and Bingham and Lavinia, Countess Spencer, Lady Betty Foster, the Countess of Harrington and children, Lady Smith and her children, Lord Burghurst, Hon. Lester Stanhope, Simplicity, Miss Gwatkin, the Penistone Lamb children, all of Bartolozzi's best, Lady Cockburn and her children, and Master Henry Hoare, the Honourable Mrs. Stanhope as Contemplation, Lady Beauchamp, afterwards Countess of Hertford, a Bacchante, Mrs. Hartley, the actress, and her child, the Spencer children in the Mask, and the Fortune Tellers, Miss Elizabeth Beauclerk, Lady Diana's daughter and Topham Beauclerks, as Una, Massipula, Robinetta, Felina, Kalina, the Sleeping Girl, Infancy. Lady Catherine Manners, the Reverie, Lord Grantham and his brothers, Mrs. Sheridan as Street Cecilia, Maternal Affection, Lady Melbourne and child, Perdita, Mrs. Robinson, Mrs. Abington as Roxalana, The Age of Innocence, The Infant Academy, The Snake in the Grass, but the list is endless. All collectors of color prints know how desirable these Reynolds stipples are to charm their walls withal. But almost unique must be the collector who can also hang among them Keating's joyous mezzotint of Reynolds's famous portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire and her baby daughter, printed in colors. This is one of those rare examples which, with J. R. Smith's Bacchante in Nature, Lady Hamilton, Henry Myers' Nature too, some of the Moreland prints by the Wards, Smith, and Keating, S. W. Reynolds's Countess of Oxford, J. R. Smith's Mrs. Bovary, and a few other important Hoppner prints, C. Turner's Pen Family, after Reynolds, Smith's Sinnet Children, after Wright of Derby, and Mrs. Robinson, after Romney, prove that, in the hands of an engraver with a painter's eye, mezzotint could respond to the colored inks as harmoniously and charmingly as stipple. Gainsborough, at least, the Gainsborough of unapproachable mastery and inimitable beauty, the greatest glory of our 18th century art, seems to have been beyond the color printer's ambition. With the exception of the Hobbinall and Ganderetta, Tomkins, reproduced here, and the Lavinia, Bartolozzi, both of which were painted for Macklin's, British Poets, I doubt if anything important of Gainsborough's was reproduced in colored stipple. And, of course, these things cannot be said adequately to represent the master. While, as to mezzotint, W. Whiston Barney's version of Gainsborough's Duchess of Devonshire was, I understand, printed in colors, though impressions are extremely rare. Romney's exquisite art, on the other hand, with its gracious simplicity of beauty, lent itself more readily to the color-printed copperplate. Among the numberless tinted engravings with which the small-paned windows of the 18th century print shops were crowded, none ingratiated themselves more with the connoisseurs than the Romneys. So, in any representative collections of color prints today, among the finest and most greatly prized examples must be the lovely Emma and Serena, Miss Snade, of John Jones, Mrs. Jordan as The Romp of Ogborne, Miss Lucy Vernon as The Seamstress, and Lady Hamilton as The Spinster of Cheeseman, the beautiful Emma also as a Bacchante by Night, as Sensibility by Earlham, and as Nature in the two mezzotint versions just mentioned, by J. R. Smith and Henry Meyer. Of course the pictorial miniatures of the fashionable Richard Cosway, with their light, bright scheme of draftsmanship, their dainty tints, their soft and sinuous graces, their delicate decision of character, were exceedingly happy in the stipple engraver's hands. In color the prints had a charm of reticence which was peculiarly persuasive. Several of the most engaging were done by the artistic Condé, such as Mrs. Bovary, Mrs. Tickle, Mrs. Jackson, Mrs. Fitzherbert, Mrs. Robinson as Melania, and the beautiful youth Horace Beckford. J. S. Agar did delicately Harriet, Lady Cockerell, as a gypsy woman, Lady Heathcote, and Mrs. Duff. Cardon, with his distinguished touch, engraved the charming Madame Recamier, Schiavonetti the Mrs. Maria Cosway in Michel and Isabella O'Ginissy, Bartolozzi the Mrs. Harding, Mariano Bovi the Lady Diana Sinclair, and Charles White the pretty Infancy, Lord Radnor's children. Only less fashionable than Cosway's were the miniatures of Samuel Shelley. In portrait manner, and in fanciful composition, Reynolds was his model and inspiration, but the result, in spite of high finish and a certain charm of elegance, was a very little Reynolds. For Shelley's drawing generally left something for criticism. Naturally, miniature painting found happy interpretation in colored stipple, and Shelley was fortunate in his engravers, especially Caroline Watson, with her exquisite delicacy and brilliantly minute finish, and William Nutter, who was equally at home with the styles of many painters. An artist whose dainty and original manner of portraiture, enjoying a great vogue in its day, was also particularly well suited to the tinted stipple was John Downman. A man of interesting personality and individual talent, he began, as a pupil and favorite of Benjamin West, to take himself seriously and ambitiously as an historical painter, to borrow a definition of the period. Indeed, after he had won a fashionable reputation for the singular charm and style of his portraits, and become an ARA. We find a contemporary critic of the Royal Academy exhibition of 1796 confessing surprise at seeing a scriptural subject painted with such exceptional care and simplicity of expression by a hand accustomed to delineate the polished and artificial beauties of a great metropolis. But it was to these portrait drawings that the artist owed his popularity, and these and the engravings of them, neglected for 3/4 of a century, are the things that today make Downman a name to conjure with among collectors. His portraits, exceptionally happy in their suggestion of spontaneous impression and genial intuition of character, were drawn with pencil, or with finely pointed black chalk or charcoal. The light tinting of hair, cheeks, lips and eyes, with the more definite coloring, in the case of the female portraits, of an invariable sash and ribbon on a white dress, was effected in a manner peculiar to himself. Instead of the usual way, the color was put on the back of the drawing, and showed through the specially thin paper he used with softened effect. How he happened upon this method of tinting his drawings is rather a romantic story. Seized by the press gang and taken to sea, about the beginning of the American War of Independence, he was kept abroad for nearly 2 years, and when, at last, he managed to return to England he found his wife and children in a state of destitution at Cambridge. There his happy gift of portraiture brought him a livelihood. One day he left by chance a drawing face downward upon the table, and one of his children began daubing some pink paint on what was seemingly a blank piece of paper. Downman, finding his drawing with daubs upon the back, perceived delicate tints upon the face, and so he looked with a discoverer's eye, and thought the thing out. And the novel way he had accidentally found of transparently tinting his drawings proved his way to prosperity. It introduced him into the houses of the socially great to the royal palace even, and the fashionable beauties of the day, as well as those who would have liked to be fashionable beauties, and the favorite actresses. All readily offered their countenances to Downman's charming pencil, knowing it would lend them the air of happy young girls. Of course there was a willing market for prints from these gladsome and novel presentations of faces which the people seemed never to tire of, so among the collector's prizes today are the Mrs. Siddons by Tomkins, the Duchess of Devonshire and the Viscountess Duncannon by Bartolozzi, Lady Elizabeth Foster by Caroline Watson, Miss Farren, Countess of Derby, by Collier, and Frances Kemble by John Jones. The social reign of the court beauties lasted over a long period, and survived many changes of fashion, from the macaroni absurdities and monstrous headdresses to the simple muslin gown and the straw picture hat. The days of those goddesses the Gunnings seem to have come again when the 3 rival duchesses, Devonshire, Rutland, and Gordon, were the autocrats of the ton, ruling the modish world not only with the sovereignty of their beauty, elegance, wit and charm, but with the fascinating audacity of their innovations and the outvying heights of their feathers. Come, Paris, leave your hills and dells. You'll scorn your dowdy goddesses, if you once see our English belles, for all their gowns and bodices. Here's Juno Devon all sublime, Minerva Gordon's wit and eyes, sweet Rutland, Venus in her prime. You'll die before you give the prize. So sang the enthusiastic poet. Though the satirical rogues who wrote squibs and drew caricatures were not quite so kind, and a writer in the Morning Post, with a whimsical turn for statistics, actually drew up a scale of bon ton, showing In a round dozen of the leading beauties of the day the relative proportions in which they possessed beauty, figure, elegance, wit, sense, grace, expression, sensibility, and principles. It is an amusing list, in which we find the lovely Mrs. Crewe, for instance, credited with almost the maximum for beauty, but no grace at all, the Countess of Jersey with plenty of beauty, grace and expression, but neither sense nor principles. The Duchess of Devonshire with more principles than beauty, and more figure than either, her Grace of Gordon with her elegance at zero, and the Countess of Barrymore supreme in all the feminine attractions. When personal gossip about these fashionable beauties was rampant upon every tongue. When the first appearance of one of them in a new mode was enough to ensure her being enviously or admiringly mobbed in the mall, naturally the portrait prints in color responded to the general curiosity. But there was a public which, having other pictorial fancies than portraiture, even pretty faces could not satisfy without the association of sentiment and story. So there were painters who, recognizing this, furnished the engravers with the popular subject picture. It was well for their link with posterity that they did so, for how many of them would be remembered today were it not for these prints? One of the most prominent was William Redmore Bigg, who won a great popularity by painting, with the imagination of a country parson, simple incidents of rustic and domestic life, charged with the most obvious sentiment. The people took these pictures to their hearts, and they were a gold mine to the engravers. As to their artistic qualities we have little opportunity of judging today except through the familiar prints. These are innumerable, and they all have a conventional prettiness. In colors the most pleasing, perhaps, are the Saturday morning of Burke, the Saturday evening and Sunday morning of Nutter, Dulce Domum and Black Monday of John Jones. Romps and truants of William Ward, Shelling Peas and the Hop Picker of Tomkins, College Breakfast, College Supper, and Rural Misfortunes of Ogborne, the Sailor Boy's Return and the Shipwrecked Sailor Boy of Goggin. Then there was William Hamilton, a prolific and prevalent artist. Sent to Italy in his youth by Robert Adam, the architect, he returned with a sort of Italianate style of storied design, classical, historical, allegorical, conventional. But, happily, he developed a light, pretty and decorative manner of treating simple familiar subjects, which was pleasing alike to engravers and public. The charming plates from Thomson's Seasons, engraved by Tomkins and Bartolozzi. The graceful set of the months by Bartolozzi and Gardiner, the idyllic morning and evening by Tomkins, with noon and night by Delettre, the numerous designs of children at play, such as Summer's Amusement, Winter's Amusement, How Smooth, Brother. Feel Again, The Castle in Danger, by Goggin, Breaking Up and the Masquerade by Nutter, Blind Man's Buff and Seesaw, Children Feeding Fowls, Children Playing with a Bird, by Knight. Playing at Hot Cockles, and others by Bartolozzi. These are among the prettiest color prints of the period and the most valued today, especially the months. Hamilton's work just synchronized with the popular vogue for the colored stipple, and without these prints how much should we know of an artist so esteemed in his day, and so industrious? One might almost ask the same of Francis Wheatley, whose popularity also survives but through the engraver's medium. It was only after his return from Dublin, where he might have continued to the end as a prosperous portrait painter had not Dublin society discovered that the lady it had welcomed as Mrs. Wheatley was somebody else's wife, that Wheatley began painting those idealized urban, rustic, and domestic subjects, which gave him such contemporary vogue and led to his prompt admission among the Royal Academicians. Had he never painted anything else he would always be remembered by his 13 Cries of London, published by Colnaghi at intervals between 1793 and 1797, and so familiar to us through the accomplished copperplates of the Schiavonetti brothers. Vendramini, Goggin and Cardon, though, alas, so wretchedly hackneyed through the innumerable paltry reproductions. But what a fascinating, interesting set of prints it is. How redolent of old lavender. How clean, serene, and country town-like the London streets appear. How sweet and fragrant they seem to smell, how idyllic the life in them. As one looks at these prints one can almost fancy one hears the old cries echoing through those quiet Georgian streets. Perhaps the London streets of 1795 were not quite so dainty as Wheatley's sympathetic pencil makes them look to have been. But, remember, that in those days lovely ladies in muslin frocks and printed calicos of the new fashion, who had sat to Reynolds, and whose portraits were in the print shop windows, were still being carried in the leisurely sedan chair. And there were many pretty airs and graces to be seen. While in those streets, too, the youthful Turner was seeing atmosphere and feeling his graphic way to immortality, and young Charles Lamb was walking about, lending his heart with usury, to all the humanity he saw in those very streets which these Wheatley prints keep so fragrant. Of the numberless other color prints after Wheatley, perhaps the most valued today are, in mezzotint, The Disaster, The Soldier's Return and The Sailor's Return, by William Ward, The Smitten Clown, by S. W. Reynolds. In stipple, The Summer and Winter of the Bartolozzi Season set, of which Westall did the Spring and Autumn, The Cottage Door and the School Door, by Keating, Setting Out to the Fair and the Fairings, by J. Egginton, and The Pretty Little Turkey Cock by de Lettre, all admirable examples of the kind of art that made Wheatley's reputation. The pleasant uninspired rusticities and sentimentalities of Henry Singleton were too popular as to engage the abilities of some of the leading engravers, who must certainly have made the best of them for the color printer, since Singleton's coloring was accounted poor even in his own day. Among the most taking examples we have Nutter's Pretty Pair, The Farmyard and the Alehouse Door, Burke's Vicar of the Parish, Egginton's Ballad Singer, Knight's British Plenty and Scarcity in India, Some Children's Subjects by Meadows and Benedetti, and E. Scott's Lingo and Cowslip, which shows that genuinely comic actor, John Edwin, and that audaciously eccentric and adventurous actress, Mrs. Wells, in O'Keeffe's notorious Haymarket farce, The Agreeable Surprise, a group which Downman also pictured, though with infinitely more spirit and character. Subjects dealing with childhood were still greatly in demand, but the public now wanted the children to be more grown up, and more mundane than the Cupids and Cherubim of Cipriani, or the baby loves and bacchanals of Lady Diana Beauclerk. So admired by Horace Walpole, and so much flattered by the engravings of Bartolozzi, Tomkins, and Bovey. The prolific Richard Westall was not behind his brother academicians in adapting his inspiration to the market, so, combining rural fancy, as required, with the sentiment of child life, he made many a parlor look homelier with his pleasant, plausible picturings. When the charm of the engraving glossed over the weaknesses, and color printing added its enticing advocacy under Westall's personal direction, we can find some justification for their popularity in such prints as Nutter's The Rosebud, The Sensitive Plant, and Cupid Sleeping. Yossi's Innocent Mischief, Innocent Revenge, and Schiavinetti's The Ghost, a pretty but unequal companion to the Mask of Reynolds. Although at this productive period of the color print William Blake's Songs of Innocence were issued, with their sweetly pictured pages of uniquely printed color, and their magic simplicity of poetry, every page having the smell of April, as Swinburne said, it does not appear that they exercised any imaginative influence on the artists who were producing children's subjects for the popular prints. Yet certainly poetic sentiment informed the grace and charm which were the characteristics of Thomas Stothard, whose prodigiously industrious and productive pencil dominated in a great measure the book illustration of the day. 5,000 designs are credited to him, and Blake himself engraved some of these in stipple. But our present concern with Stothard is in such engaging color prints as Knight's 5th of November, Feeding Chickens, The Dunce Disgraced, The Scholar Rewarded, Coming from School, and Buffet the Bear, Runaway Love, Rosina, Flora, and the popular Sweet Pole of Plymouth, Nutter's First Bite, and Just Breeched, Strutt's Nest at Home and Nest Abroad, and others of more adult interest too numerous to mention. Another popular favorite with the buyers of color prints was the Reverend Matthew William Peters, the only clergyman who ever wore the dignities of the Royal Academy, though, as a matter of fact, it was only after he had attained full academic honors that he took holy orders. Eventually, after some successful years with portraiture and fancy subjects, he resigned his R.A.ship. But it must be said that while he was painting for popularity there was a good deal of the world and the flesh about his pictures, albeit his was a very winsome view of both, to wit, the seductively pretty Sylvia and Lydia, by Dickinson, White's Love and the Enraptured Youth, John Peter Symon's Much Ado About Nothing, Hogg's Sophia, and J. R. Smith's The Chanters. The Three Holy Children in Simon's print, however, shows Peters more as we may imagine him in the light of a converted Royal Academician, converted to be chaplain to George Florizel, Prince of Wales. John Russell, whose gracious portraits in pastel appealed to fashion with the special charm of their uncommon medium, also found happy interpretation on the copperplate, especially from the delicate graver of P. W. Tompkins. The most attractive examples in colors are the charming Maria, Maternal Love, Mrs. Morgan and Child, and Children Feeding Chickens. Collier's Mrs. Fitzherbert is also one of the most desirable among the numerous Russell color prints. When the engravings of Charles Ansell's Death of a Racehorse in 1784 had an immense sale, none presumably would have believed that, 125 years later, collectors would hold him in high regard. Not for the horses that made him famous, but for 4 dainty little drawings of domestic interiors, thoroughly representative of their period, preserved in P. W. Tompkins's stipple prints, especially charming and rare in colors. Tompkins engraved other things of Ansell's, Night also. But the set of the English fireside and the French fireside, the English dressing room and the French dressing room, the two latter reproduced here, if really fine in color, must be a prize in the choicest collection. As these prints give us intimate glimpses into the home life of the smart set of the period, so, thanks to the pictorial sense of that vivacious artist Edward Days, we are able to see just how the fashionable world comported itself in the parks. An airing in Hyde Park and the promenade in St. James's Park, the one engraved by Gauguin, the other by Swaron, are alive with contemporary social and pictorial interest, and in colors they are rare to seek. Social interest, too, flavors chiefly the name of Henry William Bunbury. Classed generally with the caricaturists, among whom, even in that period of forcible and unrestricted caricature, he was certainly one of the most spontaneously humorous as he was the most refined, he had, like his brother caricaturist Thomas Rowlandson, his days of grace. In those days he did, not with flawless drawing perhaps, but with a vivid feeling for beauty, some charming things, which the engravers turned to good account in color. Among these are Morning Employments by Tompkins, The Song and the Dance by Bartolozzi, The Modern Graces by Scott, and Black-Eyed Susan by Dickinson. From his popular task of whipping with genial graphic satire the social follies and foibles of the day, Bunbury's pencil would on occasion lightly turn to thoughts of love, as in A Tale of Love, so artistically engraved by J. K. Sherwin. And it was in this mood that his discourse on love and romance would somewhat shock Fanny Burney. She did not think it quite nice in a court equerry, who was also a husband and a father, to dilate so rhapsodically on such topics. But he adored The Sorrows of Werther, which she told him she could not read, and, after all, was he not the devoted husband of Catherine Horneck, Goldsmith's Little Comedy? Rowlandson had not, of course, Bunbury's culture and refinement, but with all his rollicking Rabelaisian humor, he had faultless draftsmanship with, when he chose, a daintiness of touch and a magic grace of curve. Among his countless colored plates, however, those that can be accepted as true color prints can be numbered almost on one hand. Opera boxes and the interesting and vivid Vauxhall, spiritedly engraved by Pollard, and capitally aquatint by Francis Jukes, were not, as generally supposed, actually printed in colors. But the Sirens and Narcissa, both things of voluptuous charm, are etched and stippled and veritably color-printed in part. With very few exceptions, Rowlandson's prints were only etched by him, then aquatint and colored by other hands, he supplying a tinted drawing. When the mantle of the fashionable portrait painter had slipped naturally from the shoulders of Reynolds to those of John Hopner, and the older beauties were not as young as they used to be, and a new set of beautiful young women had meanwhile grown up, the curious public called for the new faces. So Hopner, already finely interpreted by the best mezzotint men, now readily allied himself with Charles Wilkin, a portrait painter in oil and miniature of some repute, who, as a very talented and individual stipple engraver, had won his spurs with Sir Joshua, notably in his rich engraving of the famous Lady Cockburn and her children. The new venture was a select series of portraits of ladies of rank and fashion. These, charming and desirable in monochrome, are delightful, but very rare, in color. 7 of the portraits were done by Hoppner, and show him in most gracious vein. These are Viscountesses Street Asaph and Andover, Countess of Euston, the new Duchess of Rutland, Lady Charlotte Campbell, Lady Langham, and Lady Charlotte Duncombe. The other 3 are from the spirited pencil of the engraver himself, Ladies Gertrude Villiers, Catherine Howard, and Gertrude Fitzpatrick, who as a child had sat to Reynolds for his Colina. Hoppner's Honourable Mrs. Paget as Psyche is also a charming coloured stipple, engraved by Henry Meyer. The colour-printed mezzotint seems to have found exceptional favour with Hoppner, for in that medium we have the lovely Countess of Oxford, a choice example, and Mrs. Whitbread, by S. W. Reynolds, J. R. Smith's Sophia Western and Mrs. Bovary, with an engaging suggestion of pastel, Charles Turner's Lady Cholmondeley in Child, John Jones's Mrs. Jordan as Hippolyta, John Young's Lady Charlotte Greville, Mrs. Hoppner as Eliza, Mrs. Orby Hunter, The Gods All Children, The Setting Sun, and Lady Lambton and Children, one of them Lawrence's Master Lambton, William Ward's Pretty Salad Girl, Mrs. Benwell, and the daughters of Sir Thomas Franklana, so well known in monochrome, but so exceedingly rare in colour, James Ward's Juvenile Retirement, the Douglas Children, Children Bathing, Hoppner's Own, Mrs. Hibbert, and the graceful Miranda, Mrs. Michael Angelo Taylor, of which only one impression is known in colours, exquisite in quality, that in the very choice collection of Mr. Frederick Barron's. Although Hoppner's preeminence among the portrait painters was so long established, it was seriously challenged in the Royal Academy exhibition of 1790 by the portrait of an actress from the brush of a painter only 21 years of age, who was destined to preside over the Academy and become the most fashionable painter of his day. This was Thomas Lawrence, and the portrait was that of the popular and beautiful Miss Elizabeth Farren, Countess of Derby 7 years later, in her fur-lined white cloak and muff, which was engraved by Charles Knight, with finishing touches by Bartolozzi, who signed it, and is now one of the most desired of colour prints, as it is one of the most constantly reproduced. The acknowledged beauties, however, did not monopolize the placidness of content or consciousness of superiority, which Dr. Johnson, so Johnsonianly, held was necessary to expand the human face to its full expression. Happily there were artists to see everywhere dainty and charming women who could be attractively pictured with the artistic sense of nature and actuality. Perhaps even more picturesquely for not being able always to keep their temperaments out of their faces and attitudes. One of these artists was also an eminent engraver, and at the same time an extensive print seller and publisher, with always one eye to his art and the other to the main chance. John Raphael Smith loomed very large in the London print world of the later 18th century, because he had not only the artistic ability to do the thing popularly wanted, but also the commercial intuition as to what would be likely to please the public in its varying fancies. A master of mezzotint, and monarch among the translators of Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Romney, he used with lighter touch the same medium for engraving many of his own vivacious picturings of contemporary social scenes, with their manners and fashions very much alive. A generous, convivial, cheerful liver himself, filling every hour with the activities of art, commerce and pleasure, J. R. Smith had the vivid pictorial eye for what was gay and pleasing in the life around him. Also he possessed an instinctive sense of fashion. Therefore, in the numerous attractive drawings of petty women in varied attitudes of busy idleness, we get a more real impression of the fashions of the passing hour than even the stately canvases of Sir Joshua could give us with all their artistic defiance of the modistes. Smith would engrave these himself in stipples suggesting crayon effects, with the original artist's freedom, and the mezzotinter's broad handling of tones, or he would entrust them to other engravers. Being a painter, he used colour on his plates judiciously, and among the most highly prized colour prints of the period J. R. Smith's spirited engravings hold quite an individual place. To name, perhaps, the most characteristic, Aloysius. Black, brown and fair, maid, wife, widow, and what you will, A Christmas Holiday, Flirtilla and Narcissa, The Fortune Tellers, The Mirror, Serena and Flirtilla. Thoughts on a Single Life, with its companion, Thoughts on Matrimony, engraved quite as well by William Ward, at whose hands the widow's tale makes a charming appearance in colored mezzotint. In this medium also the promenade at Carlisle House enjoys an elusive existence. Then there are Smith's lecture on Gaddying in the Moralist, stippled by Nutter, and his Credulous Lady in the Astrologer, by Simon. But not even his own designs inspired his mezzotint scraper to finer results than the splendid Almeria, Mrs. Maynot, after Opie, or his stipple graver to surer beauty than in his Mrs. Mills after Englehart, or his Snake in the Grass, after Reynolds, or those charming and familiar moorland prints Delia in town and Delia in the country, rustic employment and rural amusement, and the Letitia set, of course in their original form. J. R. Smith's was a dominating personality, and his influence on his talented pupil, William Ward, was very strong. He taught him by example, paying him the compliment of engraving in mezzotint and charmingly color printing his pupil's felicitous, moorlandish picture, The Visit to the Grandfather. He certainly made him work, and the results show not only in the innumerable fine plates which Ward produced in mezzotint and stipple after various painters, but in his own dainty drawings of charming femininity. These, such as the well-known Louise, Alinda, Lucy of Leinster, Almeida, the Soliloquy, Hesitation, Louisa Mildmay, and the Cyprian Votary, were all translated to the copper with a verve and charm. Produced by an exact understanding of the artistic economies of the stippled crayon manner, unsurpassed, perhaps not equaled, by any other engraver. When finely tinted, they show the color printer's craft at its daintiest, and their collector's taste at its highest. In the same genre are Private Amusement, Reflection, and Public Amusement, Temptation, engraved by Ward after Ramberg, a favorite pair. But very different, of course, in character are his fine mezzotints of the rural pictures of his talented, irascible younger brother James. Of these, perhaps, the best print in colors are the Citizen's Retreat, Selling Rabbits, Compassionate Children, The Haymakers, Outside of a Country Ale House, Summer and Winter, and the well-known Vegetable Market, the companion to which A Poultry Market, was finely engraved by James Ward himself, whose own attractive plates of the Rocking Horse and Rustic Felicity and a Katager going to market and a Katager returning from market, have also been printed in colors. William Ward's popular fame as an engraver, however, will doubtless rest mainly on his innumerable transcripts in stipple and mezzotint of the pictures of his brother-in-law, that natural artist, that dissolute, happy-go-lucky vagabond, that homely, facile painter of genius, George Morland. In exploiting Morland as he did, John Raphael Smith proved his unerring instinct for the right popular thing. He was answering an unconscious call for artistic virility and freshness of vision. The prints of the widest public appeal, however simple their intentions in rusticity or domesticity of subject, were merely repeating pictorial conventions, illustrating stereotyped sentiments. Bigge, Hamilton, Wheatley, Singleton, Westall, they were all doing pleasing, pretty things enough, and the public were buying the prints and hanging them on the walls of their homes, without even suspecting that nature as the true inspiration of art had but little to do with all this picture-making. Then came Morland, with his natural instinct for the true, the simple picture, his free and facile art, his charming wizardry of the palette, his happy, unaffected realism. The others had been idealizing the commonplace. Morland knew that nothing is commonplace if seen and treated with relative truth. J. R. Smith saw, both as artist and prosperous publisher of prints, that here at last was a virile genius that could charm the people's love of pictures to a clearer understanding of beauty through a true pictorial vision of nature. It was a curious coincidence that just about the same time an obscure publisher in Kilmarnock had given the Scotch lovers of song the means of recognizing in the natural lyric note of Burns a reviving impulse for English poetry. Here in Morland was a Burns on canvas, a Burns who sang with his paintbrush, who could put the moods of green grow the rashes, oh, of my Nanny, oh, or the jolly beggars, into enduring pigments as the poet had put them into immortal song. And Morland's simple pictures are classic today, because in them, irrespective of subject, is the painter's true poetry of form and color. Always susceptible to the ready comradeship, in the first consciousness of his brilliant easy powers, with his artistic ambitions bound up in his joy of living. Moreland came quickly under the influence of Smith's convivial yet energizing personality. The publisher, urged by the public's clamorous response, stimulated him to a prolific activity, and, with such engravers as Smith himself and the Wards to interpret him with masterly understanding and sympathy, and all the other engravers of note eager to do the same, Moreland soon commanded the market, or, at least, his exploiters did. It seemed that Moreland could do everything the public appeared to want, so, before he developed into the Moreland exclusively of the stable and the farmyard and picturesque vagabondage, he challenged the popular genre painters on their own ground, and beat them with the magic simplicity of nature. Could the domestic big do anything in his own line as charmingly lifelike as a visit to the child at nurse and a visit to the boarding school? Look at William Ward's mezzotints of these pictures in color, and then compare with their sweet actuality of scene and sentiment the same engraver's version of Biggs' The Birth of an Heir, with its scenic posturing and sentimentality. Then, what color prints of children could Hamilton or Stothard ever have designed to compare, for true suggestion of the bright buoyancy of childhood, with such gems as Ward's mezzotints Children Birds Nesting, Juvenile Navigators, Blind Man's Buff, The Kite Entangled, Keating's Playing at Soldiers, and Nurse and Children in a Field, Day's Children Nutting, and Tompkins's Stipple Children Feeding Goats. Moreland enjoyed to let the children of the neighborhood play and romp about his studio, and thus he could paint them naturally, with no self-consciousness on their parts and happy sympathy on his. No wonder all the engravers were agog to make copperplates from his quickly finished paintings. That charming spontaneity of picturesque impression, with luminous harmony of tones, which distinguishes all Moreland's pictures, even those painted in his least reputable days of hand-to-mouth living, is reflected in the best engravings of his multitudinous works. Of those printed in colors one may attempt a selection from the point of view of especially fine quality and rarity. Among the stipples, therefore, must be named again J.R. Smith's Rustic Employment and Rural Amusement, Delia in Town and Delia in the Country, and the famous story of Letitia series, Domestic Happiness, The Elopement, The Virtuous Parent, Dressing for the Masquerade, The Tavern Door, and The Fair Penitent, reissued in 1811 with the ample costumes of 1786 incongruously altered to the current slim empire fashion, upsetting, of course, the pictorial balance of design. Then there are Constancy, Mrs. Ward, Variety, Mrs. Moreland, and Morning, Thoughts on Amusement for the Evening, A Very Rare Oval, by William Ward. Louisa, A Pair of Large Ovals, The Lass of Livingstone, and How Sweet to Meet with Love's Return, The Famous Dancing Dogs, and Guinea Pigs, all by T. Goggin, the last pair reissued by Philip, The Tea Garden in St. James's Park, by F. D. Swaron, The Squire's Door and the Farmer's Door, by Diderot, The Farmer's Visit to His Married Daughter in Town, by W. Bond, and The Visit Returned in the Country, by Nutter, Industry and Idleness, Mrs. Moreland, by Night, and The Fair Seducer, and The Discovery, by E. J. Demy. Many of Moreland's pictures on the mezzotint plates seem to have justified the color printer, but innumerable Moreland prints were colored by hand entirely or in part, and it is said that J. R. Smith employed his young pupil Joseph Mallard William Turner upon this work. I doubt, however, if even Mr. Rawlinson could detect Turner's hand upon a Moreland print, therefore we must be content to distinguish the finest and rarest of the mezzotints actually printed in colors. To those already named we may add The Angling Party by Keating, and The Angler's Repast by William Ward, to whom we are also indebted for The Coquette at Her Toilet, The Pledge of Love, Contemplating the Miniature. Contemplation, Caroline of Lichfield, very rare, and exquisitely suggestive of the original in Mr. Thomas Barratt's wonderful Moreland collection. Cottagers, Travellers, The Thatcher, 1st of September, Morning, 1st of September, Evening, Inside of a Country Ale House, The Public House Door, The Effects of Extravagance and Idleness, The Turnpike Gate, The Sportsman's Return, and The Farmer's Stable, Moreland's National Gallery masterpiece. The Return from Market, A Beautiful Thing, and Feeding the Pigs, by J. R. Smith, Sunset, A View in Leicestershire, by James Ward, Summer and Winter by W. Barnard, Morning, or The Benevolent Sportsman, Evening, or The Sportsman's Return, by J. Grocer, and selling cherries and shelling peas, a very rare pair, etched and mezzotint by E. Bell. Then there is, The Deserter, set by Keating, enlisting a recruit deserted and detected hiding in his wife's room, the deserter handcuffed and conveyed to a court-martial, the deserter pardoned and restored to his family. A set of pictures studied with realism resulting from one of Moreland's characteristic adventures, possible, perhaps, only in the 18th century. Snipe Shooting, one of a set of 4, by G. Catton, June, must not be forgotten. It is of particular interest as showing aquatint in effective combination with stipple and etching. How important a place Moreland fills in the history of 18th-century prints, one realizes only when, looking over a collection like Mr. Thomas Barrett's at Hampstead, where the color prints are to be seen in their multitude, one attempts to note down a few gems, and finds a long list has quickly accumulated. 3. Bartolozzi had come to England as an acknowledged master of line engraving, rival even of the splendid Sir Robert Strange, and the spontaneous charm and fluent beauty of his incomparable etchings after Guercino. And the lovely lines of his Clytie in his Silence after Annibale Carracci, had simply astonished the connoisseurs. His accomplished and prolific etching point engraver carried an unaccustomed grace and delicacy into many a channel of the engraving industry. The benefit concert ticket of the humblest musician was engraved as finely and brilliantly as the diploma of the Royal Academy, while the book illustration of the day was largely enriched by the easy charm of his touch. Then, as we have seen, the little art of stipple came almost like a fairy gift to his ready hand, so opportune was the moment. Bartolozzi's sweet caressing sense of beauty found inevitable expression through the gentle possibilities of the medium, and the public became eagerly responsive. With the encouragement of a popularity daily on the increase, and the appreciation of his brother artiste, he produced those charming stipple prints which are among the masterpieces of the method, and make, for many people, the name of Bartolozzi synonymous with beautiful old color prints. He was still the true artist, doing worthy things, interpreting beauty with an elusive magic of charm all his own. Pupils flocked to his studio. Among them engravers of repute, who realized that the new and easy stipple was going to prove more remunerative than the laborious line method, or even mezzotint. Pupils, too, there were who learnt from Bartolozzi so well, that they equalled their master while yet in their pupillage, as he admitted, either with generous praise, or by the ambiguous method of signing their plates with his own name. Unfortunately for his reputation this was a practice that grew upon him, for, since the name of Bartolozzi had a distinct market value, he appended it sometimes to prints quite unworthy of its bearer. For the modern collector this, of course, involves frequent snares and delusions. Bartolozzi has been called the Achilles of 18th-century engraving, and certainly his productiveness and his influence were on quite an heroic scale. Nor was the vulnerable heel wanting to complete the simile. This was his spendthrift love of Epicurean living, which gradually dulled his artistic conscience until it made no attempt to distinguish between the demands of art and a commercial popularity. Luxurious in his habits, free with his hospitality, generous to a fault with his purse, he looked with a satisfied eye on the ever-expanding market for the colored stipple print, which practically he had created, or, at least, auspicated with beautiful offerings. And as he saw that the public would now accept almost anything tendered to it in the name of a color print, however meretricious the design or poor the engraving, he seems to have sacrificed artistic scruples to the constant need of money-making. If his purse was a sieve, the popular craze for color prints must keep on filling it. So Bartolozzi, the great and famous engraver, whose sure draftsmanship had long been as a leaning staff to the print-sellers and many an artist, actually encouraged vain but incompetent amateurs. Several of them quite pleasant ladies with pretty ideas, to make feeble, mawkish designs, which perhaps he would correct in drawing, before giving them to often half-fledged engravers, and turning them upon the market in poorly hurriedly stippled plates, specious in colored inks. As his best pupils, Tomkins, Cheeseman, Schiavonetti, Ogborn, Marquard, left him, and set up as independent engravers, Bartolozzi's studio, with its innumerable workers, gradually developed into little more than a factory for turning out popular prints as rapidly as possible. This hurry for the market seems, however, to have affected not only Bartolozzi and his engravers, but the print-selling world generally. The art critic of the Monthly Mirror, for 1796, while blaming the print-sellers as the cause, protested against the slovenly and imperfect manner in which so many prints were being turned out, declaring, moreover, that this was influencing the painters to an indifference about the execution of such works as were intended for prints, making them contented to satisfy the print or bookseller with the mere effect of light and shade. Earlier than this, however, Sir Robert Strange, who hated Bartolozzi, and for whom line engraving alone represented the dignity of the engraver's art, had predicted a sort of artistic debacle through the popularity of stipple engraving. From the nature of the operation, he wrote, and the extreme facility with which it is executed, it has got into the hands of every boy, of every print seller in town, of every manufacturer of prints, however ignorant and unskilful. I call them manufacturers, because the general run of such productions does not in reality merit the appellation of works of art and must ultimately tend to depreciate the fine arts in general, to glut the public, and to vitiate the growing taste of the nation. This art, if to it may be called, is in itself extremely limited, admits of little variety, and is susceptible of no improvement. Naturally, the great line engraver, who had worked for his fame through long arduous years, was vexed to see the very effects of soft flesh tones, which he produced to admiration with laborious mastery of point and graver, rendered so easily by stipple, and even more popularly appreciated. Yet there was a good deal of truth in his protest. The public was in time glutted, not with finely engraved color prints, but with inferior stippling of weak designs, much of it crudely colored by hand, or printed with no sense of art. But the fine arts in general were not in the least depreciated through such things. And now the charming little art has, at its old-time best, found enthusiastic lovers again, while the noble beauty of line engraving is today appreciated by only the limited few. If Strange could but revisit the glimpses of Christie's, it would more than astonish him to see there none of his own superb line engravings after the great Italian masters. But to hear the keen bidding for his old rival Bartolozzi's best color prints after Reynolds, or the Downman Duchess of Devonshire and Lady Duncannon, the Cipriani Infants, Contentment, Friendship, the Hamilton Months, or Miss Benwell's St. James's and St. Giles's Beauties, or the Orange Girl. Not a little surprised would Strange be if also he could hear how the modern collector values the work of Bartolozzi's most distinguished pupils in that same art which he in his day regarded so contemptuously. Of these, Peltro William Tomkins was Bartolozzi's own favorite. "He is my son in the art," said the master, always generous with praise of good work. "He can do all I can in this way, and I hope he will do more." Tomkins inherited the graphic tendency from his father, William Tomkins, A.R.A., a landscape painter. But, of course, it was from Bartolozzi he learnt the sweetness and grace of draftsmanship which distinguish his copperplates, whether in the engraving of his own pretty fanciful designs of children, such as He Sleeps, Innocent Play, The Wanton Trick, or the pictures of other artists. His close-grained stippling, too, had that same soft and tender rotundity of tone we find in the authentic works of the master, and of course it was peculiarly adaptable to the simple tints of the 18th-century color printer. A few of Tomkins's most attractive prints will be found among the illustrations to this volume, others I have named in speaking of the painters. The extent of his work was enormous, and it always had charm. So the collector can choose many appealing things without exhausting the list of Tomkins's capital prints. Engraver to the Queen and drawing master to the princesses, he seems to have been a favorite with the lady artists and amateurs, whose drawings frequently employed his graver, such as Julia Conyers, Princess Elizabeth, Lady Templetown, Lady Edward Bentinck, Miss Drax, and, of course, they all demanded color as a sort of prescriptive right. Among his more serious work were some good plates after the old masters, as those in Tresham's British Gallery of Pictures, rather brilliant in color. On a Virgin and Child and St. John, after Raphael, engraved and published by Tomkins at Fulham in 1789, I find, printed in color by C. Floquet, which suggests an amicable understanding between engraver and printer. For the colorist was rarely credited with his share in the old color prints. Thomas Cheeseman's engravings have at their best the free and easy charm of the artist accustomed to express his own conceptions. In his youth he lodged with Hogarth's widow, through whose influence he was entrusted with the engraving of the last stake. The work must have been a liberal education. Stippling, strengthened with etching, he learnt from Bartolozzi, and how he excelled in it may be seen in such charming prints as Romney's Spinster and Seamstress, Angelica Kauffmann's Marchioness of Townsend and Chilla, Love and Beauty, Reynolds's Reverie, his own maternal affection, and others of his graceful designs. Robert S. Marquard was another of Bartolozzi's best pupils, and his fine engraving of his master's portrait, after Reynolds, has a richness of tone and distinction of character rarely seen in stipple plates, but found also in Marquard's transcripts of others among Reynolds's male portraits. He appears to have strengthened his stippling of shadows with etching to a more than usual extent, a practice suggested, perhaps, by his work in mezzotint. Several noteworthy prints by Charles Knight have already been named. He was quite a valuable engraver of remarkable industry, and so studiously did he assimilate the Bartolozzi methods, while lacking only the master's inimitable delicacy, that he could be trusted to execute important plates which needed but Bartolozzi's own finishing touches to make them worthy of his name. These the master would unhesitatingly sign for publication, as in the case of the famous Miss Farren after Lawrence. The brilliant etching, with all the preliminary work, was Knight's, yet it is known as Bartolozzi's print. But to the various acknowledged prints of Knight's already mentioned one may add, as good examples in colors, Cupid Disarmed, and Cupid's Revenge after Miss Benwell, and the Valentine and the Wedding Ring after Ansel. John Ogborn and William Nutter learnt line engraving from that interesting engraver and valuable antiquarian, Joseph Strutt, a pupil himself of Ryland. Then they went to Bartolozzi to acquire the stipple method, through which they both achieved distinction, Nutter adding to Bartolozzi's teaching the broader influence of J. R. Smith's. John Keyes Sherwin's natural gifts were influenced to an easy grace in Bartolozzi's studio, and we owe to him a few charming stipples in color. But his brief and brilliant career, ruined by vanity, dandyism, and fashionable favor, belongs to the story of line engraving, in which it fills a lively and interesting page. Another talented individuality among the group of Bartolozzi's disciples was Edmund Scott, who did some very engaging stipples in color, of which a few have been named. His work was much favored by the popular painters. Naturally, Bartolozzi's European reputation, and rumors of the rapidity with which money could be made by the stipple method, attracted to his studio a number of pupils from the continent, where, till the war began in 1793, there was a very large and constant trade in English prints. Several fine collections, by the way, were made at the time, and some of these are still intact, notably one in Weimar. Among the foreign pupils were, of course, several Italians, of whom the most important were Luigi Schiavanetti and Giovanni Vendramini, whose names are familiar chiefly through their charming plates in the Cries of London series. Schiavanetti, however, was brilliant also in etching and line work, and not less artistic than his stipples were his engravings of Blake's beautiful illustrations to Blair's poem, The Grave. Vendramini was personally so popular that he was induced to take over Bartolozzi's business in his house at North End, Fulham, when the old man in 1802, seeing the waning of the public taste for his prints, accepted a royal invitation to Portugal, where they gave him a knighthood and a pension, and where he went on engraving and teaching till, close on 90 years of age and in straitened circumstances, he died in 1815. James Manassi, an engraver of taste, I have already mentioned as one of Bartolozzi's favorite pupils, devoted to the end. His cousin, Mariano Bovi was another, and a very artistic touch he had, as may be seen in his many engravings of Lady Diana Beauclerk's fantastic infantile groups, and the charming decorative frieze after Cipriani, reproduced here. Other notable Italian disciples were Pietro Bettolini and Michel Benedetti. Russia, which was always ready at that time to encourage the prolonged visits of English artists, sent Bartolozzi an assimilative pupil in Gabriel Skorodomov, who did several pretty color prints. Of the French pupils, John Peter Simon had perhaps the most artistic sense of the medium, and he will always be esteemed for his brilliant engraving of Reynolds's Heads of Angels, a beautiful print in colors. Jean-Marie Delettre, when once he had learnt stipple, became the master's right-hand man, forwarding many of his plates to a considerable extent, touching up and correcting the work of less competent pupils, and turning out a number of good prints of his own. Other Frenchmen there were, too, among the stipple engravers who, though not actually pupils of Bartolozzi, could not help reflecting his influence. Chief among these were Thomas Gauguin, F. D. Soiron, and B. Diderot, all of whom are represented among our illustrations by charming prints after Morland. Gauguin began his artistic life as a student of painting with Richard Houston, the eminent Mezzotint engraver, and this training seems to have lent a valuable quality of tone to his engraving. The last and rarest plate of the Cries of London, Turnips and Carrots, was his. John Condé was an ideal engraver of Cosway's miniatures, which he rendered with a touch of the utmost refinement and taste, and an exquisite sense of their adaptabilities to the copper. Scarcely less successful in this field was Schiavinetti's gifted Flemish pupil, Anthony Cardon, and it was doubtless through his master's influence that he, too, was engaged upon the Cries of London. But the Bartolozzi influence was not quite supreme. No engraver, for instance, used the stipple method with more originality or more truly pictorial effect than John Jones, who was, of course, one of the glories of the great English school of Mezzotint. At his best only to be compared for beauty with Burke, his was a broader conception of the delicate medium. And, gauging its artistic capacity to a nicety, he understood exactly how to balance breadth and depth of tone with the fine shades, while avoiding that tendency to monotony of smoothness which characterized even the best of the Bartolozzi school. His manner was quite his own, strong in its refined simplicity, artistic in its reticence, and among the most beautiful and individual color prints in stipple, few are comparable with those that Jones did after Romney, Reynolds and Downman. His exquisite Serena was one of the prints we had hoped to have included among our illustrations. Scarcely less distinctive in stipple than Jones, J.R. Smith and William Ward, was that other great artist in Mezzotint, Thomas Watson, whose stippling had the large pictorial feeling. Naturally he was happy with Reynolds, as in the lovely Una, while in the Mrs. Crewe and Mrs. Wilbraham, he made the very best of Daniel Gardner, who appears to have learnt all he could from Sir Joshua. Of the stipple engravers who made pretty and attractive color prints their name is legion, while these pages are necessarily limited. So I must regretfully leave but barely named such notable stipplers as Joseph Collier, with his vigorous touch, Francis Hayward, whose Mrs. Siddons as the tragic muse is so well known, William Bond, the versatile Robert Pollard, R.M. Meadows, the dainty John S. Agar, those three fine mezzotinters, Charles Turner, Richard Earlham, and William Dickinson, whose Duchess of Devonshire and Viscountess Duncannon has often the high distinction of pairing with Burke's Lady Rushout and daughter. The brothers Facius, Caroline Watson, with her exquisite finish whether in pure stipple or in mixed methods, Joseph Grosser. Christian Josie, to whom we are indebted for more than his engraving, in his valuable publication of Plus van Amstel's interesting second pioneering series of aquatints printed in color, Collection d'Imitations de Dessins. 23 years after Van Amstel's death. John Egginton, Charles White, a favorite engraver of the lady artists, James Hogg, whose handmaid after Walton is as charming as its companion, the Tobacco Box, Robert Thew, R.M. Pay. And William Blake, whose sure immortality is quite independent of such artistic stippling as his Mrs. Q, after Hugh Villiers, and his two Morland prints. The war with France, closing important markets for English engravings, had a depressing influence on the production of prints, and the early years of the 19th century saw fresh vagaries in the popular taste. Even the Morlands were neglected. The coarse political and social caricatures of James Gilray, once Bartolozzi's pupil, and of Thomas Rowlandson were intriguing and titillating the town with their robustious humors and audacious license. Yet Adam Buck was strangely in favor. His inadequate drawings of babies and slender women in empire gowns, which a contemporary writer describes as happily combining the taste of the antique with that of the modern, suited the spurious classic fashion of the time. These were engraved, some partly stippled, partly aquatint, by Freeman, J. C. Stadler, Roberts and even Cheeseman. Artistically negligible, the excellence of their color printing alone can excuse any demand at the present day for such pretty trifles as the darling asleep, the darling awake, the darling dancing, and so on. In their own day, notwithstanding their passing vogue, they sounded the knell of the stippled color print. Colored aquatints were now becoming the rage. That this charming and delicate process, producing various gradations of tone by successive bitings, with acid through a porous, resinous ground, might long before have competed with stipple, may be judged by the delightful pair of color-printed aquatints, Courtship and Matrimony, by Francis Jukes after W. Williams, published in 1787 by J. R. Smith. But, invented in France about 1750 by Jean-Baptiste Prince, practiced a little later with color by Plus van Amstel, and introduced to England in 1775 by Paul Sandby for the treatment of landscape. It was a long while before the pictorial capacities of aquatint were adequately understood and extended. In the artistic hands of the Daniels, the Havels, J. C. Stadler, J. Bluck, J. Sutherland and F. C. Lewis, it became, particularly under the aegis of Ackermann, a most popular medium for color, especially in the sporting and coaching prints which the Regency spirit brought so extensively into demand. Then in turn came lithography, with its ease of method and its sweet, soft graces, bringing color to, and R. J. Lane was the new hero of the print sellers, while for long years Bartolozzi and his brother stipplers on the copperplate were shelved, neglected, forgotten, and moorland prints were scarcely saleable. Today they have come into their own again, their own, and perhaps a little bit over. Notes on the illustrations. Countess of Harrington and her children, Plate I. Sir Joshua painted her twice also as Miss Fleming. Robinetta, Plate II. The Honourable Anna Talmash was the original of this picture, of which Reynolds painted 3 versions, that in the National Gallery, Lord Lonsdale's, and Lord Talmash's, from which Jones made his engraving, dedicating it to the picture's then owner the Hon. William Talmash to Master Henry Hoare, Plate 3. The only son of Sir Richard Colt Hoare, Bart, F.R.S., the well-known antiquarian and historian of Wiltshire. Duchess of Devonshire and Child, Plate 4. One of Sir Joshua Reynolds's 13 exhibits in the Royal Academy of 1786, when Walpole depreciated it. Here is the famous Duchess in that tender mother mood in which Coleridge apostrophized her so exquisitely. The chubby baby, when she grew up, very properly married the son and heir of that Earl of Carlisle who in graceful verse had championed her mother's introduction of the fashion of feathers. The Mask, Plate V. Part of the Duke of Marlborough and family, which Sir Joshua painted in 1777. The little ladies Charlotte and Spencer, being taken into the room at Blenheim where Sir Joshua sat at his easel, the youngest drew back, clutching at her nurse's gown, crying, "I won't be painted." A natural action which appealed irresistibly to Reynolds. And little Lady Anne, as Countess of Shaftesbury, lived until 1865, the last survivor of all Sir Joshua Reynolds's countless sitters. Bacchante, Emma, Lady Hamilton, Plate 6. Painted in 1784 for Sir William Hamilton, when, of course, there was no thought of the marriage. The price was 50 guineas, just about a fifth of what a brilliant impression of the print in colours would fetch today. The Honourable Charles Greville, Sir William's nephew and Emma's lover at the time, seems to have negotiated the business, for he wrote, in October 1784 to his uncle, who was then in Naples, "Let me know how the Bacchante is to be paid. The dog was ugly, and I made him paint it again." Later Greville wrote, "Emma's picture shall be sent by the first ship. I wish Romney yet to mend the dog." The picture is said to have been lost at sea, on its way back from Naples, but at Greville's sale in 1810, the Bacchante, in that case a replica of the lost canvas, was catalogued as Diana, original of the well-known engraved picture, and bought by Mr. Chamberlain for 130 guineas. Mrs. Jordan in the character of the Country Girl, Plate 7. It was as Peggy in Garrick's comedy, The Country Girl, adapted from Wycherley's Country Wife, that Dorothy Jordan first appeared at Drury Lane in 1785, and immediately bewitched the public with the natural, irresistible joyousness of her acting and the lovable charm of her personality. In the following year she gave Romney 13 sittings for this picture. At the first he could not satisfy himself as to the best pose for her. After many tries she pretended to be tired of the business, and, jumping up from her chair, in the hoydenish manner and tone of Peggy, she said, "Well, I'm going." "Stay," cried Romney, "that's just what I want." And at once he began to sketch her for this picture. It was bought in 1791 for 70 guineas by the Duke of Clarence, afterwards King William IV. And thereby, of course, hangs the well-known tale of a 20 years' love, 10 children, and unhappy separation. The print, first published as The Romp at Fives, may now fetch, if fine in colour, like Major Coates's copy, as much as £200. Hobbinall and Ganderetta, Plate 8. William Somerville's Hobbinall was a mock-heroic poem on rural games, which Mr. Gosse describes as ridiculous. Countess of Oxford, Plate 9. This is in the National Gallery. But Hoppner exhibited an earlier portrait in 1797. Jane Scott, daughter of a Hampshire vicar, married, in her 20th year, the 5th Earl of Oxford, whom Byron described as equally contemptible in mind and body. But then, she and the poet were lovers when she was 40 and he about 25. "The autumn of a beauty like hers is preferable to the spring in others," he said in after years. "I never felt a stronger passion," which, he did not forget to add, she returned with equal ardor. It was on Lady Oxford's notepaper that Byron wrote his final letter to Lady Caroline Lamb, and this in the very year in which, it now appears, he revived his boyish passion for Mary Chaworth. Viscountess Andover, Plate X. Eldest daughter of William Coke, of Holcombe, the famous agriculturist, so long MP for Norfolk, and later Earl of Leicester. St. James's Park, Plate 14. M. Grossley, a Frenchman, describes this scene in his Tour of London, 1772, agreeably to this rural simplicity. Most of these cows are driven about noon and evening to the gate which leads from the park to the quarter of Whitehall. Tied to posts at the extremity of the grass plots, they swill passengers with their milk, which, being drawn from their udders upon the spot, is served, with all the cleanliness peculiar to the English, in little mugs at the rate of a penny a mug. A. T. Garden, Plate 15. Bagnaga House had been the country residence of Nell Gwynn, and in 1757 the then-tenant accidentally discovered a chalybeate spring in his grounds, which 2 years later he turned to profit. Bagnaga Wells then developed a tea garden, with arbours, ponds with fountains and goldfish, a bun house, music, and a reputation for the amorous rendezvous. The place was very popular, and much favoured, especially on Sundays, by the would-be fashionable wives of well-to-do city folk. In the character of Madame Fussack, Coleman took this off in his prologue to Garrick's Drury Lane farce, Bon Ton. Or High Life Above Stairs, 1776. The Lass of Livingstone, Plate 16. A popular old Scotch song, words by Allan Ramsay. There is also an older version, The Bonnie Lass o' Livingston, associated with an actual person who kept a public house in the parish of Livingstone. Lady Cockerell as a Gypsy Woman, Plate 19. One of the beautiful daughters of Sir John and Lady Rushout, whose miniatures are, perhaps, Plimmer's masterpieces. Lady Duncannon, Plate XX. One of the Portraits of Four Ladies of Quality, exhibited by Downman at the Royal Academy in 1788. There are also colour prints of Viscountess Duncannon after Lavinia, Countess Spencer and Causeway, and, with her more famous sister, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, after Angelica Kaufmann. While they both figure, with other fashionable beauties, in J. K. Sherwin's picture, The Finding of Moses, also in Rowlandson's Vauxhall, and 2 prints in which the same artist celebrated their triumphant share in the Westminster election of 1784. When it was said that 2 such lovely portraits had never before appeared on a canvas. The Countess of Bessborough, as she became, was the mother of Lady Caroline Lamb. Her distinguished grandson, Sir Spencer Ponsonby Fane, kindly lent the print reproduced here. Rinaldo and Armida, Plate XXI. The Enchantment of Rinaldo, the Christian Knight, by Armida, the beautiful Oriental sorceress, in Tasso's Jerusalem Liberata. Love and Beauty, Marchioness of Townsend, Plate Ziv. One of the three beautiful daughters of Sir William Montgomery immortalized by Reynolds on the large canvas now in the National Gallery, called The Graces, decorating a terminal figure of Hymen. She married the distinguished general who finished the Battle of Quebec when Wolfe had fallen. Two bunches a penny, primroses, Plate XXV. Knives, scissors and razors to grind, Plate XXVI. Numbers 1 and 6 of the Cries of London. The other plates are, 2, Milk Below, Maids. 3, Sweet China Oranges. 4, Do You Want Any Matches? 5, New Mackerel. 7, Fresh Gathered Peas. 8, Duke Cherries. 9, Strawberries. 10, Old Chairs to Mend. 11, A New Love Song. 12, Hot Spice Gingerbread, 2 plates. 13, Turnips and Carrots. There are still in existence 2 or 3 paintings of similar character by Wheatley, one depicting a man selling copper kettles, which would suggest, besides the belated publication of the 13th plate, that it was originally intended to issue a larger number of the Cries than those we know, had the public encouragement warranted it. The color printing of the earliest impressions was superlatively fine, and in the original pink board wrappers these are, of course, extremely rare, and would realize today as much as £1,000. Mrs. Crewe, Plate XXVI. The famous beauty, Fulke Greville's daughter. It was to her house in Lower Grosvenor Street that the triumphant True Blues, the Prince of Wales among them, crowded in the evening to toast Fox's victory at Westminster. Reynolds has perpetuated Mrs. Crewe's rare beauty on 3 canvases, and Sheridan in dedicating to her The School for Scandal, did reverence to her mind as well as her features. Fox poetized in her praise, and Fanny Burney said, "She is certainly the most completely a beauty of any woman I ever saw. She uglifies everything near her." The Dance, Plate XXVI. The tradition, lately repeated in book and periodical, which gives the figures in this print as those of the Gunning sisters, is obviously absurd. When Bunbury was an infant in arms the beauty of the Gunnings first took the town by storm. Next year Maria became a countess, Elizabeth a duchess, and, when this print was done the one had been dead 22 years, the other already widowed and double duchessed, as Horace Walpole put it, the morning employments, Plate 6. The name on the harpsichord should obviously be Jacobus Kirkman, there was no Thomas. The instrument with the double keyboard is exactly like that in my own possession, which Dr. Burney selected from Jacob Kirkman's shop in 1768. When a fashionable craze for the guitar was sending the makers of harpsichords and spinets very near to bankruptcy, Kirkman bought up all his own fine instruments, which the ladies were practically giving away, for guitars. Then he purchased a lot of cheap guitars and presented them to milliners' girls and street singers, so that they were twanged everywhere and became vulgar. The ladies bought harpsichords again, and he made a large fortune. Mademoiselle Parisot, Plate XXXVI. A noted dancer in the opera ballets at the King's Theatre in the Haymarket. There is a beautiful mezzotint of her, dated 1797, by J. R. Smith after A. W. Davies. This is very rare, and in colors extremely so. Ndli. Parisot also figures as one of the 3 dancers in Gilray's caricature, Operatical Reform, or La Danse à l'évêque, published in 1798 to ridicule the Bishop of Durham's protest against the scanty attire of the ballet dancers. Maria, Plate XXXVI. Maria of Moulins, in Sterne's Sentimental Journey. Malcolm C. Salaman. Plate I. Jane, Countess of Harrington. Lord Viscount Petersham and the Honourable Lincoln Stanhope. Stipple engraving by F. Bartolozzi, R.A. After. Sir Joshua Reynolds, P.R.A. Published 1789. Size 8 3/4 x 11. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 2. Robinetta. Stipple engraving by John Jones, after Sir Joshua Reynolds, P.R.A. Published 1787. Size 8x10.5. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 3. Master Henry Hoare. Stipple engraving by C. Wilkin, after Sir Joshua Reynolds, P.R.A. Published 1789. Size 7x9. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 4. The Duchess of Devonshire and Lady Georgiana Cavendish. Mezzotint engraving by G. O. Keating, after Sir Joshua Reynolds, P.R.A. Published 1787. Size 15x12.25. From the collection of Frederick Barons, Esq. Plate V. The Mask. Stipple engraving by L. Schiavonetti, after Sir Joshua Reynolds, P.R.A. Published 1790. Size 9¼ x 7. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 6. Bacchante, Lady Hamilton. Stipple engraving by C. Knight, after George Romney. Published 1797. Size 10½ x 12. From the collection of Frederick Barons, Esq. Plate 7. Mrs. Jordan in the character of The Country Girl, The Romp. Stipple engraving by John Ogborn, after George Romney. Published 1788. Size 9x12. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 8. Hobbinall and Ganderetta. Stipple engraving by P. W. Tompkins, after Thos. Gainsborough, R.A. Published 1790. Size 14x18¼ From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 9. Countess of Oxford. Mezzotint engraving by S. W. Reynolds, after J. Hopner, R.A. Published 1799. Size 8-1/10. From the collection of Frederick Barons, Esq. Plate X. Viscountess Andover. Stipple engraving by C. Wilkin, after J. Hopner, R.A. Published 1797. Size 6x8. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 11. The Squire's Door. Stipple engraving by B. Diderot, after George Morland. Published 1790. Size 12-4x15. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 12. The Farmer's Door. Stipple engraving by B. Diderot, after George Morland. Published 1790. Size 12¾ x 15. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 13. A Visit to the Boarding School. Mezzotint engraving by W. Ward, A.R.A., after George Morland. Published 1789. Size 21¾ x 17. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 14. St. James's Park. Stipple engraving by F. D. Swaron, after George Morland. Published 1790. Size 19¾ x 16. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 15. A Tea Garden. Stipple engraving by F. D. Swaron, after George Morland. Published 1790. Size 19¾ x 16. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate 16. The Lass of Livingstone. Stipple engraving by T. Goggin, after George Morland. Published 1785. Size 11¾ x 9¾ From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 17. Rustic Employment. Stipple engraving by J. R. Smith, after George Morland. Published 1788. Size 9 3/4 times 12 1/4. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate 18. The Soliloquy. Stipple engraving by and after William Ward, R.A. Published 1787. Size 7 1/2 times 11. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate 19. Harriet, Lady Cockerell as a Gypsy Woman. Stipple engraving by J. S. Agar, after Richard Causeway, R.A. Published 1810. Size 8 by 11. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XX. Lady Duncannon. Stipple engraving by F. Bartolozzi, R.A., after John Downman, R.A. Published 1797. Size 6 times 7 3/4. From the collection of Right Honourable Sir Spencer Ponsonby Fane, G.C.B. Plate XXI. Cupid bound by nymphs. Stipple engraving by W. W. Ryland, after Angelica Kaufman, R.A. Published 1777. Size 11 1/2. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate XXI. Rinaldo and Armida. Stipple engraving by Thomas Burke, after Angelica Kaufman, R.A. Published 1795. Size 10 1/4 times 13. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXI. Angelica Kaufman in the character of design listening to the inspiration of poetry. Stipple engraving by Thomas Burke, after Angelica Kaufman, R.A. Published 1787. Size 12. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate Ziv. Love and Beauty. Marchioness of Townsend. Stipple engraving by Thomas Cheeseman. After Angelica Kaufman, R.A. Published 1792 and 1795. Size 10 by 12. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XXV. 2 bunches a penny, primroses. Cries of London. Stipple engraving by L. Schiavanetti. After F. Wheatley, R.A. Published 1793. Size 10 3/4 times 14. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XXVI. Knives, scissors and razors to grind. Cries of London. Stipple engraving by G. Vendramini. After F. Wheatley, R.A. Published 1795. Size 11 by 14. From the collection of Mrs. Julia Franco. Plate XXVI. Mrs. Crewe. Stipple engraving by Thos Watson, after Daniel Gardner. Published 1780. Size 6 times 8-1/. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate XXVI. The Dance. Stipple engraving by F. Bartolozzi, R.A., after H. W. Bunbury. Published 1782. Size 11. From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P. Plate 6. Morning Employments. Stipple engraving by P. W. Tompkins, after H. W. Bunbury. Published 1789. Size 14 1/4. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XXX. The Farmyard. Stipple engraving by William Nutter, after Henry Singleton. Published 1790. Size 9 3/4 times 11. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XXXI. The Vicar of the Parish receiving his tithes. Stipple engraving by Thomas Burke, after Henry Singleton. Published 1793. Size 12 by 14. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XXXI. The English Dressing Room. Stipple engraving by P. W. Tompkins, after Chas. Ansell. Published 1789. Size 7½ times 9½. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXXI. The French Dressing Room. Stipple engraving by P. W. Tompkins, after Chas. Ansell. Published 1789. Size 7½ times 9½. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXXIV. January, the months. Stipple engraving by F. Bartolozzi, R.A., after. William Hamilton, R.A. Published 1788. Size 10 by 12. From the collection of J. H. Edwards, Esq. Plate XXXV. Virtuous Love, from Thomson's Seasons. Stipple engraving by F. Bartolozzi, R.A., after. William Hamilton, R.A. Published 1793. Size 6¼ times 5. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXXVI. The Chanters. Stipple engraving by J. R. Smith, after. Reverend Matthew W. Peters, R.A. Published 1787. Size 7. From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXXVI. Ndli. Parasat. Stipple engraving by C. Turner, A.R.A. After J. J. Masquerier. Published 1799. Size 6 by 8. From the collection of Mrs. Julia Franco. To whom it was presented by the late Sir Henry Irving. Plate XXXVI. Maria. Stipple engraving by P. W. Tompkins, after J. Russell, R.A. Published 1791. Size 4¾ times 6¼ From the collection of Frederick Behrens, Esq. Plate XXXAX. Commerce. Stipple engraving by M. Bovey, after J. B. Cipriani, R.A. and F. Bartolozzi, R.A. Published 1795. Size 18 by 7. From the collection of Basil Dighton, Esq. Plate XL. The Love Letter. A very rare stipple engraving, probably by thus Cheeseman. And F. Bartolozzi, R.A. Size 8¾ times 6¾ From the collection of Major E. F. Coates, M.P.